not forget to hit record so that Crad can see this and everybody can see this, I will be obviously I'm gonna need to be recording these for this month. So if you guys could just remind me at the start of any stream that you think about it, because they should be probably fine if I forget to record them, because I could download them from Twitch afterwards, but the quality will be reduced. So, and also I don't know how to do that, and I have to learn how, and I might just forget to. So we need to remember to record these. But I've got the recording running now, so nobody's gonna miss a word. They're not gonna miss the recap. What I wanted to do, what I thought would be pretty funny, is, and I didn't do this now, so you're just gonna have to live with it. Um, possibly I'll do this in the future. What I was thinking about doing is I have my whiteboard here that I keep, and I was just gonna download like shitty stock images for every character, and then we could do like a recap that way, and we could put them all up. I was like, I think for Wendy I'll just download the Wendy's logo, but I didn't do that level of preparation ahead of time. I had a lot going on today. And also, it probably would not have involved lots of text because I got to type that out in real time. So it would have just been it would have just been images. Obviously, for Jack, you have to get a bottle of Jack Daniels. I mean, come on, his name is Jack Daniel Torrance. That's not a mistake that they made. Anyways, so it was 2 weeks ago now that I first uploaded the first 6 chapters of The Shining, so that's long enough that a pretty serious recap is in order, I think. Um, First things first, if anybody has anything that they want to talk about while we're going over the recap, anything that stood out to them, I'm like, please, pretty please, whether it's a question or it's something that you noticed, like this is a participation is highly encouraged type of event we're doing. So, like, that's a thing. So, to go over the start again, obviously, you know, um, The Shining was written in, I want to say it was published in 77. I think I wrote it down somewhere, and I definitely read it out when we first started. I believe it was 77, and I believe the movie was 80, and it was the third Stephen King novel ever. He had published Carrie at that point, and one other that I don't remember. I don't think it's a super popular one, and then The Shining. So, like, yeah, it's extremely early. I think Carrie was his first book ever that he got published, and he published another one, and somebody will have to look up what that is, and then he published The Shining, and that's really, like, I think that's a big part of the reason I love this book so much, even though I'm not really a Stephen King fan, because he's not really Stephen King yet in terms of all the stuff that annoys me about his writing style. You know what I mean? He's not really fallen into a lot of his trappings, I think, by the time that The Shining was published. So first thing I think we can do is we can go through it by chapters. Although I don't really remember. Well, we'll just pull it up because there's one chapter where I'm kind of like, it's very transitional, and I don't really remember what happened in it specifically. I have all the stuff marked. So let me pull back, and I have the book in front of me here. I'm flipping through it, and we're looking at some of the notes I've made and stuff. Yeah, chapter 5 is the talk with Al. What happens in chapter 4? I think chapter 4 is like, oh, chapter 4 is when Doc talks about Tony showing him the future and divorce and stuff. I always confuse that with, yeah, because that chapter 4 is Shadowland. Yeah, okay. So the first thing that happens in The Shining, obviously in chapter 1, as you guys remember, is we meet Jack Torrance, and we meet Stuart Ullman, who is giving him the interview for the job of winter caretaker of the Overlook. The Overlook Hotel is high in the Colorado mountains, probably one of the highest, they say probably like one of the highest places that you still find buildings It's like summit of one of the what are those? The Andes that goes through Colorado? Is that the Andes? I don't know, honestly. Somebody knows. But and because it's up, it's this extremely extravagant hotel. Four presidents have stayed there. I mean, it was millionaires, war heroes, famous musicians, politicians, mobsters, everybody all throughout history has stayed at this Overlook Hotel, and it's extremely prestigious and expensive. But because it's so high up in the mountains, it only has a 6-month operating season, and that is May through whatever May plus 6 is. What's that? Is that September, October? It has a 6 months operating season, and then it's closed for 6 months. Um, it might have a little bit of longer operating season. I think they're closed from November to May. I don't think that's quite. No, that is. Yeah, 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 yeah. They're closed from November to May. So, yeah, yeah, they operate from in the middle of May to October, I think. And they close in the middle of November, I think. Okay, yeah, yeah, yeah. So the other 6 months of the year, the Overlook has to be closed because it gets so cold and the snow piles up so hard that it's completely impossible to operate, right? Like by the time it's like January, the snow in those mountains and the drifts has piled it up to where it's like several stories up in the Overlook and you're completely snowed in. There's absolutely no way to get in or out of the Overlook. The roads, they say, on the mountain, they close after the first few snowfalls, and the plows don't go up there because it's too dangerous. So there's absolutely no way on or off the mountain for about 6 months of the year, and that's why they close. And so Jack Torrance is being interviewed to be the winter caretaker. They hire a guy who just he comes in, he keeps an eye on the boiler, he manages the heating, he keeps the place clean. He's in there by himself or just with his family in Jack's case. And he looks after the place for those 6 months, and it's a dangerous job, right? They talk about like this is a dangerous job because if you fall down and crack your skull in the middle of February and the snow is up so high that you would have to climb out the third story window to even get outside and try to get to the snowmobile to get to the hospital, and the shed with the snowmobile is buried under 2 stories of snow, like you're fucked, you're completely fucked, you know. So it's a dangerous, but it's a very well-paying job. I think the implication, they don't talk about this, but I think the implication is like if you do the job for 6 months, they want to pay you. The payment they'll give you is enough to get you through the next 6 months, so that you could come back. So that's like a 6-month paycheck, in addition to 6 months that you don't really pay for anything for. You're not paying rent on the Overlook. You're not paying utilities or food. So the financial capacity there is incredibly high. And so the reason that Jack has been driven to take this job because he was an English teacher at a prep academy, and he lost his job. He lost his temper. We don't really know a lot of the details. I think we'll get into this tonight, but we don't really know a lot of the details. But we know that he struck a kid. He lost his temper. He struck a kid, and he was fired. And he completely, I mean, couldn't get another job at another place. Like he went from a English teacher that was making a lot of money and like well liked by his students, a promising young writer. He was writing novels and shit in his off time, and now he's nothing like that. Nothing. He's got no prospects, and so he's taken this job. His wealthy friend Al who is a controlling shareholder in the Overlook, has given this job because he's like, I want to help you get back on your feet. And so Jack Torrance is going to bring his wife, Wendy Torrance, and his son, Danny Doc Torrance, and they're going to live in the Overlook for 6 months. And everything's going to get better, basically, is their plan. They're going to get a bunch of money. Um, Jack is going to finish a play he's working on and get it published. Al is going to use that time to try and convince the board at the Prep Academy to give him another chance. All they got to do is make it through one off season at the Overlook. That's the first character we meet. We know that he's a former alcoholic. He's been sober for 2 years now. He put a hand on his child, Doc, one day 2 years ago, like in a drunken rage, and he's basically been sober since then. There was another event about a week later, but he managed to preserve his marriage by quitting alcohol cold turkey, and he's been sober for 2 years. The next character we meet is Doc. He's 5 years old. He doesn't really understand the move that they went on. Um, he doesn't really. He understands that his dad whacked a kid back at Stovington, so they had to move from Vermont to Colorado, and he sort of understands that they're going to be stuck in a hotel for 6 months. The thing that we learn right away about Doc is that there's something going on in his mind that appears to be possibly supernatural or could be schizophrenic. We know that he has an imaginary friend who visits him when he concentrates very hard and shows him visions, things that could possibly be of the future or things that could be like just hallucinations that he's having. He said sometimes his imaginary friend named Tony will show him where there was an example of he showed Tony showed Doc where his dad's trunk was, and his dad had spent the whole day tearing up the house looking for his trunk that all his papers are in, and there was no way for Danny to know it was in the cellar because it was locked. But Tony showed him, and he was like, "Dad, it's in the cellar." And so there's that sounds pretty supernatural. But he also says that sometimes Tony shows him things that aren't true or that don't come true. Sometimes he shows him things he doesn't understand at all. So it's a bit messy. But we know that what we see happen is that while Jack is up there giving an interview with Mr. Ullman about the Overlook and his position as a winter caretaker, um, Doc is like sitting on the side of the road waiting for his dad to come home. He loves his dad. He's super excited to see his dad again, see if he got the job. And he waits until his mom is not paying attention, and he starts concentrating to bring Tony around to give him a vision. And he has an extremely, extremely distressing vision that he doesn't fully understand. He imagines himself being stuck in a hallway, being chased. He imagines that somebody is pounding the walls next to him, like exploding dust and plaster everywhere from pounding the walls in the hallways, being chased in. They're yelling after him. They're yelling something like, "Come take your medicine, you little shit! It's time for your medicine!" And he's just running as fast as he can. He's like seeing words appear, in the sky around him. The one he sees one through the reflection of a mirror that says red rum that he doesn't understand because he can't really read whole like a lot yet, but he can sound out what red rum. He sees that word and he doesn't understand it, and he's very freaked out. And so he wakes up from his vision in like a sweat, and he's like, "That's not like Tony doesn't usually show me things like that. Like that's fucked up." And then we move on to chapter 3, and Jack Torrance is now down in the basement. He's talking to the maintenance guy named Watson, who's a very crude guy, but he teaches Jack how to do everything in the basement. He's like, here's the boiler, here's the heating controls. He says you have to let the pressure off on the boiler a couple times a day because this thing is old as balls and it has no automatic stop feature. It could, if you don't let pressure off on it, it could burst, and you could send this whole hotel sky high. And he shows him a bunch of old papers. He tells him a little bit about the history of the hotel. He talks about a famous sort of ghost sighting incident that happened a couple years ago where a woman committed suicide in one of the rooms with sleeping pills in the tub. And for a few days after that happened, there's a maid that came in and swore that she saw the woman's dead body in the tub, even though it had been removed already. And because Jack wants to hear a little bit about the not so squeaky clean things that the hotel manager, Mr. Ullman, won't tell him. So that's the story that he gets. After that is when we start to meet Wendy Torrance a little more, Jack's wife. She is not working right now. When Jack was at the prep academy, she was typing up. She was doing like transcription, I think, and she was helping make a lot of money. She strongly, strongly considered divorcing Jack and felt like a strong hate for him after the night 2 years ago when he put his hands on Doc and broke Doc's arm. But she was shocked that he was able to go completely sober after that. And we know that he has stayed sober. We know that he hasn't secretly relapsed or anything. And between that and the shame of having to go back home to her needling, emotionally abusive mother, but those two factors, she decided to stay, and at least for Doc's benefit, and eventually sort of began to reconcile with Jack, and we know from some of the things that Doc says that they do start to feel love for each other more lately, and they don't think about divorce as much. And you know, we know that Jack doesn't think about suicide as much from more vision as he used to from more visions that Doc is having. And so we get to see her perspective a little bit. We know that she feels extremely conflicted about this hotel thing. She's nervous. It sounds like a really good opportunity. She maybe thinks it's a little too good to be true, possibly. And so she's going along with it because it seems like it could make everything better, but like she definitely has reservations. All three of them have reservations, but least of all Jack, who is really the one who knows this is his last chance. He is not thinking about reservations at all. He's thinking this is going to be great for me, and even if it's not, it has to be, you know. But Wendy's a little scared. She's a little more aware of the things that could go wrong, and obviously Doc is having bad visions that he thinks are possibly related to the hotel. He's having bad dreams about it and stuff. So what happens is that Jack drives home. He declares that he has the job. Um, he drives to a payphone out at the grocery store to call Mr. Al Shockley, his friend Al that gave him the job. He doesn't want to call him in front of Wendy. He feels like it maybe would be a little bit of a violation of his pride or whatever. And he thanks him again. Al's like, no worries. Are you staying dry? I'll have the board around by spring, I think. Like, I'm already starting to break them down a little bit, making them think they made a mistake. And so the two of them have a good conversation, and Jack reflects a little bit about his time with Al and how Al used to be an alcoholic too, and how one night they were driving drunk and they smashed into a bicycle that was sitting in the middle of the road and swore there was a kid there, but there never ended up being one, and spooked the hell out of him. Never touched alcohol since that day. All that kind of stuff. We talk about that. And then the last chapter that we read, chapter 6, Night Thoughts, is about Wendy, and she's laying in bed, drifting off to sleep, and she's thinking a little bit about her past and her dad, who she describes as a really sweet, funny guy, and he's dead now, and talks about how bitter and vindictive and needling her mom is, and how she never goes over there anymore because her mom is always like trying to make her feel like a bad mother. She's like, oh, you didn't change Danny's diaper properly, why is he wearing that, this and that. And so she thinks about her parents a lot, and she worries about her kid, obviously, as you can imagine. She says something to the effect of like, she's like, somebody in the divine parent assignment department up there made a big mistake, I think, and the person who's going to pay for it is the most innocent party. She's very nervous about her kid. She loves him more than anything in the world, but she feels a lot of. She knows that her husband is unstable, and she feels a lot of confliction about the fact that Doc seems to gravitate maybe a little more be his father's boy than his mother's boy. And we just get to feel a lot of the anxiety that she's feeling, and it's building up. And so today, I've spoken for 20 minutes already. I really want to get to the book. We got a lot to get through today. We're going to meet the best character today. We're going to meet the best character in the whole Shining. Hands down, nobody can contest. We have one really short chapter to get through before we start closing day. And we're going to probably get through all of closing day, where the Torrances arrive on the last day of the Overlook's operation, and they get the final reminders, they get the tour, they get, here's where you're going to stay, and all that is what we're going to cover today. So we're going to get right into it. Does anybody have any questions, any clarifications, or anything that you don't remember or that you didn't think made sense? I mean, participation encouraged. I'm going to take a drink while I wait for if there's anything. Okay. All right. So, before closing day, we have Chapter 7 called In Another Bedroom. Stay here. Thank you, book. Danny awoke with the booming still loud in his ears, and the drunk... Oh, I skipped a page. What? I just lost my place. I have an ebook, and if I do so much as pull a hair off my screen, it changes the page. Danny awoke with the booming still loud in his ears, and the drunk, savagely pettish voice crying hoarsely, "Come out here and take your medicine! I'll find you! I'll find you!" But now the booming was only his racing heart, and the only voice in the night was the faraway sound of a police siren. He lay in bed motionlessly, looking up at the wind-stirred shadows of the leaves on his bedroom ceiling. They twined sinuously together, making shapes like the veins and creepers in a jungle, like patterns woven into the nap of a thick carpet. He was clad in Dr. Denton pajamas, but between the pajama suit and his skin he had grown a more closely fitting singlet of perspiration. "Tony?" he whispered. "You there?" No answer. He slipped out of bed and padded silently across the window and looked out on Arapahoe Street, now still and silent. It was 2 in the morning. There was nothing out there but empty sidewalks drifted with fallen leaves, parked cars, and the long-necked street light on the corner across from the Cliff Bryce gas station. With its hooded top and motionless stance, the street light looked like a monster in a space show. He looked up on the street both ways, straining his eyes for Tony's slight, beckoning form, but there was no one there. The wind sighed through the trees, and the fallen leaves rattled up the deserted walks and around the hubcaps of parked cars. It was a faint and sorrowful sound, and the boy thought that he might be the only one in Boulder awake enough to hear it. The only human being, at least. There was no way of knowing what else might be out in the night, slinking hungrily through the shadows, watching and scenting the breeze. "I'll find you! I'll find you!" "Tony?" he whispered again, but without much hope. Only the wind spoke back, gusting more strongly this time, scattering leaves across the sloping roof below his window. Some of them slipped into the rain gutter and came out to rest like tired dancers. "Danny! Danny!" He started at the sound of that familiar voice and craned out the window, his small hands on the sill. With the sound of Tony's voice, the whole night seemed to have come silently and secretly alive, whispering even when the wind quieted again, and the leaves were still and the shadows had stopped moving. He thought he saw a darker shadow standing by the bus stop a block down, but it was hard to tell if it was a real thing or an eye trick. "Don't go, Danny!" Then the wind gusted again, making him squint, and the shadow by the bus stop was gone, if it had ever been there at all. He stood by his window for a minute, an hour, some time longer, but there was no more. At last he crept back into his bed and pulled the blankets up and watched the shadows thrown by the alien streetlight turn into a sinuous jungle filled with flesh-eating plants that wanted only to slip around him, squeeze the life out of him, and drag him down into a blackness where one sinister word flashed in red. Red rum. And thus begins Part 2, Closing Day. Chapter 8, A View of the Overlook. Mommy was worried. She was afraid the bug wouldn't make it up and down all these mountains and that they would get stranded by the side of the road where somebody might come ripping along and hit them. Danny himself was more sanguine. If Daddy thought the bug could make it one last trip, then probably it would. "We're just about there," Jack said. Wendy brushed her hair back from her temples. Thank God. She was sitting in the right-hand bucket, a Victoria Holt paperback open but face down in her lap. She was wearing her blue dress, the one Danny thought was her prettiest. It had a sailor collar and made her look very young, like a girl just getting ready to graduate from high school. Daddy kept putting his hand high up on her leg, and she kept laughing and brushing it off, saying, "Get away, fly." Danny was impressed by the mountains. One day Daddy had taken them up in the ones near Boulder, the ones they had called the Flatirons, but these were much bigger, and on the tallest of them you could see a fine dusting of snow, which Daddy had said was there year-round. And they were actually in the mountains, no goofing around. Sheer rock faces rose all around them, so high you could barely see their tops even by craning your neck out the window. When they left Boulder, the temperature had been up in the high 70s. Now, just after noon, the air up here felt crisp and cold like November back in Vermont, and Daddy had the heater going. Not that it worked all that well. They had passed several signs that said "Falling Rock Zone." Mommy read each one to him. And although Danny had waited anxiously to see some rock fall, none had. At least not yet. Half an hour ago they had passed another sign that Daddy said was very important. This sign said, "Entering Sidewinder Pass." Daddy said this sign was as far as the snowplows went in the winter time. After that the road got too steep. In the winter the road was closed from the little town of Sidewinder, which they had gone through just before they got to that sign, all the way to Buckland, Utah. Now they were passing another sign. "What's that one, Mom?" "That one says, 'Slower vehicles use right lane.' That means us." "The bug'll make it," Danny said. "Please God," Mommy said, and crossed her fingers. Danny looked down at her open-toed sandals and saw that she had crossed her toes as well. He giggled. She smiled back, but he knew that she was still worried. The road wound up and up in a series of slow S-curves, and Jack dropped the bug's stick shift from fourth gear to third, then into second. The bug wheezed and protested, and Wendy's eye fixed on the speedometer needle, which sank from 40 to 30 to 20, where it hovered reluctantly. "The fuel pump," she began timidly. "The fuel pump will go another 3 miles," Jack said shortly. The rock wall fell away on their right, disclosing a slash valley that seemed to go down forever, lined a dark green with Rocky Mountain pine and spruce. The pines fell away to gray cliffs of rock that dropped for hundreds of feet before smoothing out. She saw a waterfall spilling over one of them, the early afternoon sun sparkling in it like a golden fish snared in a blue net. They were beautiful moments, but they were hard. They were beautiful mountains, but they were hard. She did not think they would forgive many mistakes. An unhappy foreboding rose in her throat. Further west in the Sierra Nevada, the Donner Party had become snowbound and had resorted to cannibalism to stay alive. The mountains did not forgive many mistakes. With a punch of the clutch and a jerk, Jack shifted down to first gear and they labored upward, the bug's engine thumping gamely. You know, she said, I don't think we've seen 5 cars since we came through Sidewinder, and one of them was the hotel limousine. Jack nodded. Goes right to Stapleton Airport in Denver. There's already some icy patches up beyond the hotel, Watson says, and they're forecasting more snow for tomorrow up higher. Anybody going through the mountains now wants to be on one of the main roads just in case. Goddamn Ullman better still be up there. I guess he will be. You're sure the larder is fully stocked? She asked, still thinking of the Donners. He said so. He wanted Halloran to go over it with you. Halloran's the cook. Oh, she said faintly, looking at the speedometer. It had dropped from 15 to 10 miles an hour. There's the top, Jack said, pointing 300 yards ahead. There's a scenic turnout, and you can see the overlook from there. I'm going to pull off the road and give the bug a chance to rest. He craned over a shoulder at Danny, who was sitting on a pile of blankets. What do you think, Doc? We might see some deer. Or caribou. Sure, Dad. The VW labored up and up. The speedometer dropped to just above the 5-mile-an-hour hash mark and was beginning to hitch when Jack pulled off the road. What's that sign, Mommy? Scenic turnout, she read dutifully, and stepped on the emergency brake and let the VW run in neutral. Come on, he said, and got out. They walked to the guardrail together. That's it, Jack said, and pointed at 11 o'clock. For Wendy, it was discovering truth in a cliche. Her breath was taken away. For a moment she was unable to breathe at all. The view had knocked the wind from her. They were standing near the top of one peak. Across from them, who knew how far, an even taller mountain reared into the sky, its jagged tip only a silhouette that was now nimbused by the sun, which was beginning its decline. The whole valley floor was spread out below them, the slopes that they had climbed in the laboring bug falling away with such dizzying suddenness that she knew to look down there for too long would bring on nausea and eventual vomiting. The imagination seemed to spring to full life in the clear air, beyond the reign of reason, and to look was to helplessly see oneself plunging down and down, sky and slopes changing places in slow cartwheels, the scream drifting from your mouth like a lazy balloon as your hair and your dress billowed out. She jerked her gaze away from the drop almost by force and followed Jack's finger. She could see the highway clinging to the side of this cathedral spire, switching back on itself, but always trending northwest, still climbing, but at a more gentle angle. Further up, seemingly set directly into the slope itself, she saw the grimly clinging pines give way to a wide square of green lawn, and standing in the middle of it, overlooking all this, the hotel, the overlook. Seeing it, she found breath and voice again. Oh, Jack, it's gorgeous. Yes, it is, he said. Ullman says he thinks it's the single most beautiful location in America. I don't care much for him, but I think he might be. Danny? Danny, are you all right? She looked around for him, and her sudden fear for him blotted out everything else, stupendous or not. She darted toward him. He was holding onto the guardrail and looking up at the hotel, his face a pasty gray color. His eyes had the blank look of someone on the verge of fainting. She knelt beside him and put steadying hands on his shoulders. Danny, what's... Jack was beside her. You okay, Doc? He gave Danny a brisk little shake, and his eyes cleared. I'm okay, Daddy. I'm fine. What was it, Danny? She asked. Were you dizzy, honey? No, I was just thinking. I'm I'm sorry. I didn't mean to scare you. He looked at his parents kneeling in front of him and offered them a small puzzled smile. Maybe it was the sun. The sun got in my eyes. We'll get you up to the hotel and give you a drink of water, Daddy said. Okay. And in the bug, which moved upward more surely on the gentle grade, he kept looking out between them as the road unwound, affording occasional glimpses of the Overlook Hotel, its massive bank of westward-looking windows reflecting back the sun. It was the place he had seen in the midst of the blizzard, the dark and booming place where some hideously familiar figure sought him down long corridors carpeted with jungle, the place Tony had warned him against. It was here. It was here. Whatever Red Rum was, it was here. That's the end of chapter 8. That's exciting. So we're seeing, obviously, a mix of the foreboding and the exciting, especially when it comes to Jack and Wendy, who are more, they know that this is their last chance. They're really trying to look on the bright side of it. They're talking about how beautiful it is. But, Danny, in addition to his supernatural or schizophrenic or whatever's going on with him, he's also like not so predisposed to be optimistic about the place because he's 5 years old. He doesn't comprehend that how badly they need the money and stuff. So we're seeing he's getting a lot of feelings of dread about it that even the anxious Wendy is not getting as much. Chapter 9, checking it out. Ullman was waiting for them just inside the wide, old-fashioned front doors. He shook hands with Jack and nodded coolly at Wendy, perhaps noticing the way heads turned when she came through the lobby, her golden hair spilling across the shoulders of the simple navy dress. The hem of the dress stopped at a modest 2 inches above the knee, but you didn't have to see more to know they were good legs. Ullman seemed truly warm around Danny only, but Wendy had experienced that before. Danny seemed to be a child for people who ordinarily held W.C. Fields sentiments about children. He bent a little from the waist and offered Danny his hand. Danny shook it formally without a smile. "My son, Danny," Jack said, "and my wife, Winifred." "I'm happy to meet you both," Ullman said. "How old are you, Danny?" "5, sir." "Sir yet." Ullman smiled and glanced at Jack. "He's well-mannered." "Of course he is," Jack said. "And Miss Torrance." He offered the same little bow, and for a bemused instant Wendy thought he would kiss her hand. She half offered it, and he did take it, but only for a moment, clasped it in both of his. His hands were small and dry and smoothed, and she guessed that he powdered them. The lobby was a bustle of activity. Almost every one of the old-fashioned high-backed chairs was taken. Bellboys shuttled in and out with suitcases, and there was a line at the desk which was dominated by a huge brass cash register. The Bank AmeriCard and MasterCharge decals on it seemed jarringly anachronistic. To their right, down toward a pair of tall double doors that were pulled closed and roped off, there was an old-fashioned fireplace, now blazing with birch logs. 3 nuns sat on a sofa that was drawn up almost to the hearth itself. They were talking and smiling with their bags stacked up to either side, waiting for the checkout line to thin a little. As Wendy watched them, they burst into a chord of tinkling girlish laughter. She felt a smile touch her own lips. Not one of them could be a day under 60. In the background was the constant hum of conversation, the muted ding of the silver-plated bell beside the cash register as one of the 2 clerks on duty struck it. The slightly impatient call of "Front, please!" It brought back strong, warm memories of her honeymoon in New York with Jack at the Beekman Tower. For the first time she let herself believe this might be exactly what the 3 of them needed. A season together, away from the world, a sort of family honeymoon. She smiled affectionately down at Danny, who was goggling around frankly at everything. Another limo, as gray as a banker's vest, had pulled up out front. "The last day of the season," Ullman was saying. "Closing day. Always hectic. I had expected you more around 3, Mr. Torrance." "I wanted to give the Volks time for a nervous breakdown if it decided to have one," Jack said. "It didn't." "How fortunate," Ullman said. "I'd like to take the 3 of you on a tour of the place a little later. And of course Dick Halloran wants to show Miss Torrance the Overlook's kitchen. But I'm afraid—" One of the clerks came over and almost tugged his forelock. "Excuse me, Mr. Ullman." "Well, what is it?" "It's Mrs. Brandt," the clerk said uncomfortably. "She refuses to pay her bill with anything but her American Express card. I told her we stopped taking American Express at the end of the season last year, but she won't—" His eyes shifted to the Torrance family, then back to Ullman. He shrugged. "I'll take care of it." "Thank you, Mr. Ullman." The clerk crossed back to the desk where a dreadnought of a woman, bundled in a long fur coat and what looked like a black feather boa, was remonstrating loudly. Hold on. Does anybody know this word? Remonstrating. Okay, yeah, she was remonstrating loudly. "I have been coming to the Overlook Hotel since 1955," she was telling the smiling, struggling clerk. "I continued to come even after my second husband died of a stroke on that tiresome road court. I told him the sun was too hot that day. And I have never, I repeat, never, paid with anything but my American Express credit card. Call the police if you like. Have them drag me away. I will still refuse to pay with anything but my American Express card. I repeat." "Excuse me," Mr. Ullman said. They watched him cross the lobby, touch Miss Brandt's elbow deferentially, spread his hands, and nod when she turned her tirade on him. He listened sympathetically, nodded again, and said something in return. Miss Brandt smiled triumphantly, turned to the unhappy desk clerk, and said loudly, "Thank God there is one employee in this hotel who hasn't become an utter Philistine." She allowed Ullman, who barely came to the bulky shoulder of her fur coat, to take her arm and lead her away, presumably to his inner office. "Woohoo!" Wendy said, smiling. "There's a dude who earns his money." "But he didn't like that lady," Danny said immediately. "He was just pretending to like her." Jack grinned down at him. "Well, I'm sure that's true, Doc. But flattery is the stuff that greases the wheels of the world." "What's flattery?" "Flattery," Wendy told him, "is when your daddy says he likes my new yellow slacks even if he doesn't. Or when he says I don't need to take off 5 pounds. "Oh. Is it lying for fun?" "Something very like that." He had been looking at her closely and now said, "You're pretty, Mommy." He frowned in confusion when they exchanged a glance and then burst into laughter. "Ullman didn't waste much flattery on me," Jack said. "Come over by the window, you guys. I feel conspicuous standing out here in the middle with my denim jacket on. I honest to God didn't think there'd be anybody much here on closing day." "I guess I was wrong." "You look very handsome," she said, and then they laughed again, Wendy putting a hand over her mouth. Danny still didn't understand, but it was okay. They were loving each other. Danny thought this place reminded her of somewhere else, the Beekman place, where she had been happy. He wished he liked it as well as she did, but he kept telling himself over and over that the things Tony showed him didn't always come true. He would be careful. He would watch for something called red rum. But he would not say anything unless he absolutely had to, because they were happy. They had been laughing, and there were no bad thoughts. "Look at this view," Jack said. "Oh, it's gorgeous. Danny, look." But Danny didn't think it was particularly gorgeous. He didn't like heights. They made him dizzy. Beyond the wide front porch, which ran the length of the hotel, a beautifully manicured lawn, there was a putting green on the right, sloped away to a long rectangular swimming pool. A closed sign stood on a little tripod at one end of the pool. Closed was one sign he could read by himself, along with stop, exit, pizza, and a few others. Beyond the pool was a gravelled path, wound off through baby pines and spruces and aspens. Here was a small sign he didn't know. Roque. There was an arrow below it. "What's Roque, Daddy?" "A game," Daddy said. "It's a little bit like croquet, only you play it on a gravel court that has sides like a big billiard table, instead of grass. It's a very old game, Danny. Sometimes they have tournaments here." "Do you play with a croquet mallet?" "Like that," Jack agreed, "only the handle's a little shorter, and the head has two sides. One side is hard rubber, and the other side is wood." "Come out, you little shit." "It's pronounced roque," Daddy was saying. "I'll teach you how to play if you want." "Maybe," Danny said in an odd, colorless little voice that made his parents exchange a puzzled look over his head. "I might not like it, though." "Well, if you don't like it, Doc, you don't have to play, all right?" "Sure." "Do you like the animals?" Wendy asked. "That's called a topiary." Beyond the path leading to Roque, there were hedges clipped into the shapes of various animals. Danny, whose eyes were sharp, made out a rabbit, a dog, a horse, a cow, and a trio of bigger ones that looked like frolicking lions. "Those animals were what made Uncle Al think of me for the job," Jack told him. "He knew that when I was in college I used to work for a landscaping company. That's a business that fixes people's lawns and bushes and hedges. I used to trim a lady's topiary." Wendy put a hand over her mouth and snickered. Looking at her, Jack said, "Yes, I used to trim her topiary at least once a week." "Get away, Fly," Wendy said, and snickered again. "Did she have nice hedges, Dad?" Danny asked, and at this they both stifled great bursts of laughter. Wendy laughed so hard that tears streamed down her cheeks, and she had to get a Kleenex out of her handbag. "Well, they weren't animals, Danny," Jack said when he had control of himself. "They were playing cards, spades and hearts and diamonds. But the hedges grow, you see." "They creep," Watson had said. "No, not the hedges, the boiler. You have to watch it all the time or you and your family end up on the fucking moon." They looked at him, puzzled. His smile had faded off his face. "Dad?" Danny asked. He blinked at them, as if coming back from far away. "They grow, Danny, and lose their shape. So I'll have to give them a haircut once or twice a week, until it gets so cold they stop growing for the year." "And a playground, too," Wendy said. "My lucky boy." The playground was beyond the topiary. 2 slides, a big swing set with half a dozen swings set at varying heights, a jungle gym, a tunnel made of cement rings, a sandbox, and a playhouse that was an exact replica of the Overlook itself. "Do you like it, Danny?" Wendy asked. "I sure do," he said, hoping he sounded more enthused than he felt. "It's neat." Beyond the playground there was an inconspicuous chain-link security fence. Beyond that, the wide, I don't know this one, macadamized drive that led up to the hotel, and beyond that the valley itself, dropping away into the bright blue haze of the afternoon. Danny didn't know the word isolation, but if someone had explained it to him, he would have seized on it. Far below, lying in the sun like a long black snake that had decided to snooze for a while, was the road that led back through Sidewinder Pass and eventually to Boulder. The road that would be closed all winter long. He felt a little suffocated at the thought, and almost jumped when Daddy dropped his hand on his shoulder. "I'll get you that drink as soon as I can, Doc. They're a little busy right now." "Sure, Dad." Miss Brant came out of the inner office looking vindicated. A few moments later, 2 bellboys, struggling with 8 suitcases between them, followed her as best they could as she strode triumphantly out the door. Danny watched through the window as a man in a gray uniform and a hat like a captain in the army brought her long silver car around to the door and got out. He tipped his cap to her and ran around to open the trunk. And in one of those flashes that sometimes came, he got a complete thought from her, one that floated above the confused, low-pitched babble of emotions and colors he usually got in crowded places. "I'd like to get into his pants." Danny's brow wrinkled as he watched the bellboys put her cases into the trunk. She was looking rather sharply at the man in the gray uniform, who was supervising the loading. Why would she want to get into that man's pants? Was she cold, even with that long fur coat on? And if she was that cold, why hadn't she just put on some pants of her own? His mommy wore pants just about all winter. The man in the gray uniform closed the trunk and walked back to help her into the car. Danny watched closely to see if they would say anything about his pants, but she only smiled and gave him a dollar bill tip. A moment later, she was guiding the big silver car down the driveway. He thought about asking his mother why Miss Brant might want the carman's pants, and decided against it. Sometimes questions could get you into a whole lot of trouble. It had happened to him before. So instead he squeezed in between them on the small sofa they were sharing and watched the people check out at the desk. He was glad his mommy and daddy were happy and loving each other, but he couldn't help being a little worried. He couldn't help it. That's the end of chapter 9. Alright. Making good time. Next up is chapter 10. I advertised to you guys that we would be meeting the best character in the book, in the really the whole extended universe of everything of The Shining. And we're going to do that now. I'm very excited for it. Chapter 10, Halloran. The cook didn't conform to Wendy's image of the typical resort hotel kitchen personage at all. To begin with, such a personage was called a chef, nothing so mundane as a cook. Cooking was what she did in her apartment kitchen when she threw all the leftovers into a greased Pyrex casserole dish and added noodles. Furthermore, the culinary wizard of such a place as the Overlook, which advertised in the resort section of the New York Sunday Times, should be small, rotund, and pasty-faced, rather like the Pillsbury Doughboy. Pillsbury Doughboy. That's a tongue twister. He thought he should have a thin, pencil-lined mustache like a 40s musical comedy star, dark eyes, a French accent, and a detestable personality. Halloran had the dark eyes, and that was all. He was a tall black man with a modest afro that was beginning to powder white. He had a soft southern accent, and he laughed a lot, disclosing teeth too white and too even to be anything but 1950 vintage Sears and Roebuck dentures. Her own father had had a pair, which he called Roebuckers, and from time to time he would push them out at her comically at the supper table. Always, Wendy remembered now, when her mother was out in the kitchen getting something else or on the telephone. Danny had stared up at this black giant in blue serge, maybe that's supposed to say suede, and then he had smiled when Halloran picked him up easily, set him in the crook of his elbow, and said, "You ain't gonna stay up here all winter." "Yes, I am," Danny said with a shy grin. "No, you're gonna come down to St. Pete's with me and learn to cook and go out at the beach every damn evening watching for crabs, right?" Danny giggled delightedly and shook his head no. Halloran set him down. "If you're going to change your mind," Halloran said, bending over him gravely, "you better do it quick. 30 minutes from now and I'm in my car. 2.5 hours after that, I'm sitting at Gate 32, Concourse B, Stapleton International Airport in the mile-high city of Denver, Colorado. 3 hours after that, I'm renting a car at the Miami Airport on my way to sunny St. Pete's, waiting to get out of my swim trunks and just laughing up my sleeve at anybody stuck and caught in the snow. Can you dig it, my boy?" "Yes, sir," Danny said, smiling. Halloran turned to Jack and Wendy. "Looks like a fine boy there." "We think he'll do," Jack said, and offered his hand. Halloran took it. "I'm Jack Torrance. My wife, Winifred. Danny you've met." And a pleasure it was. "Ma'am, are you a Winnie or a Freddie?" "I'm a Wendy," she said, smiling. "Okay, that's better than the other two, I think. Right this way. Mr. Ullman wants you to have the tour you'll get." He shook his head and said under his breath, "And won't I be glad to see the last of him." Halloran commenced to tour them around the most immense kitchen Wendy had ever seen in her life. It was sparkling clean. Every surface was coaxed to a high gloss. It was more than just big, it was intimidating. She walked at Halloran's side while Jack, wholly out of his element, hung a little back with Danny. A long wall board hung with cutting instruments, which went all the way from paring knives to two-handed cleavers, hung beside a four-basin sink. There was a breadboard as big as their Boulder's apartment kitchen table. An amazing array of stainless steel pots and pans hung from floor to ceiling, covering one whole wall. "I think I'll have to leave a trail of breadcrumbs every time I come in," she said. "Don't let it get you down," Halloran said. "It's big, but it's still only a kitchen. Most of this stuff you'll never even have to touch. Keep it clean, that's all I ask." "Here's the stove I'd be using if I was you. There's 3 of them in all, but this one's the smallest." Smallest, she thought, dismally looking at it. There were 12 burners, 2 regular ovens, and a Dutch oven, a heated well on top in which you could simmer sauces or bake beans, a broiler and a warmer, plus a million dials and temperature gauges. "All gas," Halloran said. "You've cooked with gas before, Wendy, right?" "Yes." "I love gas," he said, and turned on one of the burners. Blue flame popped into life, and he adjusted it down to a faint glow with a delicate touch. "I like to be able to see the flame you're cooking with. You see where all the surface burner switches are?" "Yes." "And the oven dials are all marked. Myself, I favor the middle one, because it seems to heat the most even. But you use whichever one you like, or all 3 for that matter." "A TV dinner in each one," Wendy said, and laughed weakly. Halloran roared. "Go right ahead if you like. I left a list of everything edible over by the sink. You see it?" "Here it is, Mommy." Danny brought over 2 sheets of paper written closely on both sides. "Good boy," Halloran said, taking it from him and ruffling his hair. "You sure you don't want to come to Florida with me, my boy? Learn to cook the sweetest shrimp creole this side of paradise?" Danny put his hands over his mouth and giggled and retreated to his father's side. "You 3 folks could eat up here for a year, I guess," Halloran said. We got a cold pantry, a walk-in freezer, all sorts of vegetable bins, and 2 refrigerators. Come on, and let me show you." For the next 10 minutes Halloran opened bins and doors, disclosing food in such amounts as Wendy had never seen before. The food supplies amazed her, but did not reassure her as much as she might have thought. The Donner Party kept returning to her, not with thoughts of cannibalism. With all this food, it would indeed be a long time before they were reduced to such poor rations as each other, but with the reinforced idea that this was indeed a serious business. When snow fell, getting out of here would not be a matter of an hour's drive to Sidewinder, but a major operation. They would sit up here in this deserted Grand Hotel, eating the food that had been left for them like creatures in a fairy tale, and listening to the bitter wind around their snowbound eaves. In Vermont, when Jack broke Danny's arm, she had called the emergency medic squad, dialing a number from the little card attached to the phone. They had been at the house only 10 minutes later. There were other numbers written out on that little card. You could have a police car in 5 minutes, and a fire truck in even less time than that because the fire station was only 3 blocks away and 1 block over. There was a man to call if the lights went out, a man to call if the shower stopped up, a man to call if the TV went on the fritz. But what would happen if Danny had one of his fainting spells and swallowed his tongue? Oh God, what a thought. What if the place caught on fire? What if Jack fell down the elevator shaft? And what if we have a wonderful time? Now stop it, Winifred. Halloran shoved them into the walk-in freezer first, where their breath puffed out like comic strip balloons. In the freezer, it was as if winter had already come. Hamburger in big plastic bags, 10 pounds in each bag, a dozen bags. 40 whole chickens hanging from a row of hooks in the wood-planked walls. Canned hams stacked up like poker chips, a dozen of them. Below the chickens, 10 roasts of beef, 10 roasts of pork, and a huge leg of lamb. "You like lamb, Doc?" Halloran asked, grinning. "I love it," Danny said immediately. He had never had it. "I knew you did. There's nothing like 2 good slices of lamb on a cold night with some mint jelly on the side. You got the mint jelly here, too. Lamb eases the belly. It's a non-contentious sort of meat." From behind them, Jack said curiously, "How did you know we call him Doc?" Halloran turned around. "Pardon?" "Danny. We call him Doc sometimes, like in the Bugs Bunny cartoons." "Sort of looks like a doc, doesn't he?" He wrinkled his nose at Danny, smacked his lips, and said, "What's up, Doc?" Danny giggled, and then Halloran had said something, "Sure you don't want to go to Florida, Doc?" to him, very clearly. He had heard every word. He looked at Halloran, startled and a little scared. Halloran winked solemnly and turned back toward the food. Wendy looked from the cook's broad serge-clad back to her son. She had the oddest feeling that something had passed between them, something she could not quite follow. "You got 12 packages of sausage, 12 packages of bacon," Halloran said. "So much for the pig. In this drawer, 20 pounds of butter." "Real butter?" Jack asked. "The A number 1. I don't think I've had real butter since I was a kid back in Berlin, New Hampshire." "Well, you'll eat it up in here till Olio seems a treat," Halloran said, and laughed. "Over in this bin you got your bread, 30 loaves of white, 20 of dark. We try to keep a racial balance at the Overlook, don't you know. Now, I know 50 loaves won't take you through, but there's plenty of makings, and fresh is better than frozen any day of the week. Down here you got your fish. Brain food, right, Doc?" "Is it, Mom?" "If Mr. Halloran says so, honey," she smiled. Danny wrinkled his nose. "I don't like fish." "You're dead wrong," Halloran said. "You just never had any fish that liked you. This fish here would like you fine. 5 pounds of rainbow trout, 10 pounds of turbot, 15 cans of tuna fish. Oh, yeah, I like tuna. And 5 pounds of the sweetest tasting sole that ever swam in the sea, my boy. When next spring rolls around, you're going to thank old—" He snapped his fingers as if he had forgotten something. "What's my name now? I guess it just slipped my mind." "Mr. Halloran," Danny said, grinning. "Dick to your friends." "That's right. And you being a friend, you make it Dick." As he led them into the far corner, Jack and Wendy exchanged a puzzled glance, both of them trying to remember if Halloran had told them his first name. "And this here I put in special," Halloran said. "Hope you folks enjoy it." "Oh, really, you shouldn't have," Wendy said, touched. "It was a 20-pound turkey wrapped in a wide scarlet ribbon with a bow on top." "You got to have your turkey on Thanksgiving, Wendy," Halloran said gravely. "I believe there's a capon back there somewhere for Christmas. Doubtless you'll stumble on it. Let's come on out of here now before we all catch pneumonia. Right, Doc?" "Right." There was more wonders in the cold pantry. 100 boxes of dried milk. Halloran advised her gravely to buy fresh milk for the boy in Sidewinder for as long as it was feasible. 5 12-pound bags of sugar, a gallon jug of blackstrap molasses, cereals, glass jugs of rice, macaroni, spaghetti, ranked cans of fruit and fruit salad, a bushel of fresh apples that scented the whole room with autumn, dried raisins, prunes, and apricots. "You got to be regular if you want to be happy," Halloran said, and pealed laughter at the cold pantry ceiling, where one old-fashioned light globe hung down on an iron chain. A deep bin filled with potatoes, and smaller caches of tomatoes, onions, turnips, squashes, and cabbages. My word, Wendy said as they came out. With seeing all that fresh food after her $30 a week grocery budget had her so stunned that she was unable to say just what her word was. I'm running a bit late, Halloran said, checking his watch, so I'll just let you go through the cabinets and the fridges as you get settled in. There's cheeses, canned milk, sweetened condensed milk, yeast, baking soda, a whole bag full of those table talk pies, a few bunches of bananas that ain't even near to ripe yet. Stop, she said, holding out a hand and laughing. I'll never remember it all. It's super, and I promise to leave the place clean. That's all I ask. He turned to Jack. Did Mr. Ullman give you the rundown on the rats in this belfry? Jack grinned. Said there were possibly some in the attic, and Mr. Watson said there might be some more down in the basement. There must be 2 tons of paper down there, but I didn't see any shredded, as if they'd been using it to make nests. That Watson, Halloran said, shaking his head in mock sorrow. Ain't he the foulest talking man you ever ran on? He's quite a character, Jack agreed. His own father had been the foulest talking man Jack had ever ran on. It's sort of a pity, Halloran said, leading them back toward the wide swinging doors that gave on the overlooked dining room. There was money in that family long ago. It was Watson's granddad, or great-granddad, I can't remember which, that built this place. So I was told, Jack said. Well, what happened? Wendy asked. Well, they couldn't make it go, Halloran said. Watson will tell you the whole story twice a day if you let him. The old man got a bee in his bonnet about the place. He let it drag him down, I guess. He had 2 boys, and one of them was killed in a riding accident on the grounds while the hotel was still a building. That would have been 1908 or 1909. The old man's wife died of the flu. Then it was just the old man and his youngest son. They ended up getting took back on as caretakers in the same hotel the old man had built. Sort of a pity, Wendy said. What happened to him? The old man? Jack asked. Plugged his finger into a light socket by mistake, and that was the end of him, Halloran said. Sometime in the early 30s before the Depression closed his place down for 10 years. Anyway, Jack, I'd appreciate it if you and your wife would keep an eye out for rats in the kitchen as well. If you should see them, traps, not poison. Jack blinked. Of course. Who'd want to put rat poison in the kitchen? Halloran laughed derisively. Mr. Ullman, that's who. That was his bright idea last fall. I put it to him, I said, and what if we all get up here next May, Mr. Ullman, and I serve the traditional opening night dinner, which just happens to be salmon in a very nice sauce, and everybody gets sick and the doctor comes and says to you, Ullman, what have you been doing up here? You got 80 of the richest folks in America suffering from rat poisoning. Jack threw his head back and bellowed laughter. What did Ullman say? Halloran tucked his tongue into his cheek as if feeling for a bit of food in there. He said, get some traps, Halloran. This time they all laughed, even Danny, although he was not completely sure what the joke was, except that it had something to do with Mr. Ullman, who didn't know everything after all. The 4 of them passed through the dining room, empty and silent now, with its fabulous western exposure on the snow-dusted peaks. Each of the white linen tablecloths had been covered with a sheet of tough, clear plastic. The rug, now rolled up for the season, stood in one corner like a sentinel on guard duty. Across the wide room was a double set of bat-winged doors, and over them an old-fashioned sign lettered in gilt script. The Colorado Lounge. Following his gaze, Halloran said, If you're a drinking man, I hope you brought your own supplies. That place is picked clean. Employees party last night, don't you know? Every maid and bellhop in this place is going around with a headache today, me included. I don't drink, Jack said shortly. They went back in the lobby. It had cleared greatly during the half hour they spent in the kitchen. The long main room was beginning to take on the quiet, deserted look that Jack supposed they would become familiar with soon enough. The high-backed chairs were empty, the nuns who had been sitting by the fire were gone, and the fire itself was down to a bed of comfortably glowing coals. Wendy glanced out into the parking lot and saw that it was all but a dozen cars had disappeared. She found herself wishing they could get back in the VW and go back to Boulder, or anywhere else. Jack was looking around for Ullman, but he wasn't in the lobby. A young maid with ash blonde hair pinned up on her neck came over. Your luggage is out on the porch, Dick. Thank you, Sally. He gave her a peck on the forehead. You have yourself a good winter. Getting married, I hear. He turned to the Torrances as she strolled away, backside twitching partly. I've got to hurry along if I'm going to make that plane. I want to wish you all the best. I know you'll have it. Thanks, Jack said. You've been very kind. I'll take good care of your kitchen, Wendy promised. Enjoy Florida. I always do, Halloran said. He put his hands on his knees and bent down to Danny. Last chance, guy. Want to come to Florida? I guess not, Danny said, smiling. Okay. Like to give me a hand out to my car with my bags? If my mommy says I can. You can, Wendy said, but you'll have to have that jacket buttoned. She leaned forward to do it, but Halloran was ahead of her, his large brown fingers moving with smooth dexterity. I'll send him right back in, Halloran said. That's fine, Wendy said, and followed them to the door. Jack was still looking around for Ullman. The last of the Overlook's guests were checking out at the desk. Next scene in Chapter 10. The next chapter is Chapter 11. The Shining is the name of it, so that's exciting. I'm going to take a quick bathroom break. I'm back. Okay, so we got to meet Mr. Halloran, who is a fucking treasure, a gift to humanity. Um, we know there's a little bit of something that was weird about him, though. I mean, he knew that he started calling Danny Doc before he seems to have ever heard Jack or Wendy use it. We also know that Doc called him Dick. Now, their names are Dick and Doc, which I just realized, which is very silly. Um, Doc had called him Dick. And obviously, King is messing around a little bit with our perception of just to what extent the supernatural things are. If you pay attention closely, you'll notice that Mr. Ullman actually called him Dick in front of Danny in the previous chapter. So it's not entirely out of the possibility that he would know Mr. Halloran's name is Dick. But he said Dick to your friends, which is not something that Mr. Ullman brought up. So, a little bit of weirdness there. This chapter is called The Shining, and this is possibly the most important chapter that we will read tonight in terms of explaining things and answering questions and stuff. So you better be here. I hope that you're all here because this is this is the one that you have to pay attention to. So are we all convened? Is everybody back from their bathroom? I'll give you a second to type in the chat and confirm that we're ready to move on. Just because this is a big one. I can check my messages while I wait. You're convened? Good, good. Let me read this message real quick. Woo! Is that what? Doritos chip? Is that a universal emoji? Hold on. Can anybody do that? Let's fucking go. Sorry, okay. Chapter 11 The Shining. There were 4 bags in a pile just outside the door. 3 of them were giant, battered old suitcases covered with black imitation alligator hide. The last was an oversized zipper bag with a faded tartan skin. Guess you can handle that one, can't you? Halloran asked him. He picked up 2 of the big cases in one hand and hoisted the other under his arm. Sure, Danny said. He got a grip with it in both hands and followed the cook down the porch steps, trying manfully not to grunt and give away how heavy it was. A sharp and cutting fall wind had come up since they arrived. It whistled across the parking lot, making Danny wince his eyes down to slits as he carried the zipper bag in front of him, bumping on his knees. A few errant aspen leaves rattled and turned across the now mostly deserted asphalt, making Danny think momentarily of that night last week when he had wakened out of his nightmare and had heard, or thought he had heard at least, Tony telling him not to go. Halloran set his bags down by the trunk of a beige Plymouth Fury. "This ain't much a car," he confided to Danny. "It's just a rental job. My Bessie's on the other end. She's a car. 1950 Cadillac. And does she run sweet? I'll tell the world. I keep her in Florida because she's too old for all this mountain climbing. You need a hand with that?" "No, sir," Danny said, and he managed to carry it the last 10 or 12 steps without grunting and set it down with a large sigh of relief. "Good boy," Halloran said. He produced a large key ring from the pocket of his blue serge. I don't know what this word Serge. If anybody knows about that, please tell me. Serge jacket, and unlocked the trunk. As he lifted the bags, he said, "You shine on, boy. Harder than anyone I ever met in my life, and I'm 60 years old this January." "Huh?" "You got a knack," Halloran said, turning to him. "Me, I've always called it the shining. That's what my grandmother called it, too. She had it. We used to sit in the kitchen when I was a boy no older than you, and have long talks without even opening our mouths." "Really?" Halloran smiled at Danny's open-mouthed, almost hungry expression and said, "Come on up and sit in the car with me for a few minutes. I want to talk to you." He slammed the trunk. In the lobby of the Overlook, Wendy Torrance saw her son get into the passenger side of Halloran's car as the big black cook slid in behind the wheel. A sharp pang of fear struck her, and she opened her mouth to tell Jack that Halloran had not been lying about taking their son to Florida. There was a kidnapping afoot. But they were only sitting there. She could barely see the small silhouette of her son's head, turned attentively toward Halloran's big one. Even at this distance, that small head had a set to it that she recognized. It was the way her son looked when there was something on the TV that was particularly fascinating. Serge is a jacket with a military look that isn't military. How do you pronounce it? Is it like Sergey or is it Serge? It was the way her son looked when there was something on the TV that particularly fascinated him, or when he and his father were playing old maid or idiot cribbage. Jack, who was still looking around for Ullman, hadn't noticed. Wendy kept silent, watching Halloran's car nervously, wondering what they could possibly be talking about that made Danny cock his head in that way. In the car, Halloran was saying this. Get you kinda lonely thinking you were the only one? Danny, who had been frightened as well as lonely sometimes, nodded. Am I the only one you ever met? He asked. Halloran laughed and shook his head. No, child, no. But you shine the hardest. Are there lots then? No, Halloran said, but you do run across them. A lot of folks, they got a little bit of shine to them. They don't even know it, but they always seem to show up with flowers when their wives are feeling blue with the monthlies. They do good on school tests they didn't even study for. They got a good idea how people are feeling as soon as they walk into a room. I come across 50 or 60 like that, but maybe only a dozen counting my Graham who knew they was shining. Wow, Danny said and thought about it. Then, do you know Miss Brant? Her? Halloran said scornfully. She don't shine. Just sends her supper back 2, 3 times every night. I know she doesn't, Danny said earnestly. But do you know the man in the gray uniform that gets the carts? Mike? Sure, I know Mike. What about him? Mr. Halloran, why would she want his pants? What are you talking about, boy? Well, she was watching him. She was thinking she would sure like to get into his pants, and I just wondered why. But he got no further. Halloran had thrown his head back, and rich, dark laughter issued from his chest, rolling around the car like cannon fire. The seat shook with the force of it. Danny smiled, puzzled, and at last the storm subsided by fits and starts. Halloran produced a large silk handkerchief from his breast pocket like a white flag of surrender and wiped his streaming eyes. Boy, he said, snorting a little, you are going to know everything there is to know about the human condition before you make 10. I don't know if I envy you or not. But Miss Brant, you never mind her, he said, and don't go asking your mom either. You'd only upset her, dig what I'm saying? Yes, sir, Danny said. He dug it perfectly well. He had upset his mother that way in the past. That Miss Brant is just a dirty old woman with an itch. That's all you have to know. He looked at Danny speculatively. How hard can you hit, Doc? Huh? Give me a blast. Think at me. I want to know if you got as much as I think you do. What do you want me to think? Anything. Just think it hard. Okay, Danny said. He considered it for a moment, then gathered his concentration and flung it out at Halloran. He had never done anything precisely like this before, and at the last instant some instinctive part of him rose up and blunted some of the thoughts raw force. He didn't want to hurt Mr. Halloran. Still, the thought arrowed out of him with a force like he never would have believed. It went like a Nolan Ryan fastball with a little extra on it. Gee, I hope I don't hurt him. And the thought was, Hi, Dick! with about 8 exclamation points. Halloran winced and jerked backward on the seat. His teeth came together with a hard click, drawing blood from his lower lip in a thin trickle. His hands flew up involuntarily from his lap to the level of his chest, and then settled back again. For a moment his eyelids fluttered limply, with no conscious control, and Danny was frightened. Mr. Halloran? Dick, are you okay? I don't know, Halloran said and laughed weakly. I honest to God don't. My God, boy, you're a pistol. I'm sorry, Danny said, more alarmed. Should I get my daddy? I'll run and get him. No, here I come. I'm okay, Danny. You just sit right there. I feel a little scrambled, that's all. I didn't go as hard as I could, Danny confessed. I got scared at the last minute. Probably my good luck you did. My brains would be leaking out my ears. He saw the alarm on Danny's face and smiled. No harm done. What did it feel like to you? Like I was Nolan Ryan throwing a fastball, he replied promptly. You like baseball, do you? Halloran was rubbing his temples gingerly. Daddy me like the Angels, Danny said. The Red Sox in the American League East and the Angels in the West. We saw Red Sox against Cincinnati in the World Series. I was a lot littler then. And Danny's face went dark and troubled. Was what, Dan? I forget, Danny said. He started to put his thumb in his mouth and suck it, but that was a baby trick. He put his hand back in his lap. Can you tell what your mom and dad are thinking, Danny? Halloran was watching him closely. Most times if I want to, but usually I don't try. Why not? Well, he paused a moment, troubled. It would be like peeking into the bedroom and watching them while they're doing the thing that makes babies. Do you know that thing? I have had acquaintance with it, Halloran said gravely. They wouldn't like that. They wouldn't like me peeking at their thoughts. It would be dirty. I see. But I know how they're feeling, Danny said. I can't help that. I know how you're feeling, too. I hurt you. I'm sorry. It's just a headache. I've had hangovers that were worse. Can you read other people, Danny? I can't read at all, Danny said, except a few words. But Daddy's going to teach me this winter. My daddy used to teach reading and writing in a big school. Mostly writing, but he knows reading, too. I mean, can you tell what anybody is thinking? Danny thought about it. I can if it's loud, he said finally. Like Miss Brant and the pants. Or once, when me and Mommy were in this big store to get me some shoes, there was a big kid looking at the radios. He was thinking about taking one without buying it. Then he'd think, what if I get caught? Then he'd think, I really want it. He was making himself sick about it, and he was making me sick. Mommy was talking to the man who sells the shoes, so I went over and I said, Kid, don't take the radio. Go away. And he got really scared. He went away fast. Halloran was grinning broadly. I bet he did. Can you do anything else, Danny? Is it only thoughts and feelings, or is there more? Cautiously. Is there more for you? Sometimes, Halloran said. Not often. Sometimes. Sometimes there are dreams. Do you dream, Danny? Sometimes, Danny said. I dream when I'm awake, after Tony comes. His thumb wanted to go into his mouth again. He had never told anyone but Mommy and Daddy about Tony. He made his thumb-sucking hand go back into his lap. Who's Tony? And suddenly Danny had one of those flashes of understanding that frightened him most of all. It was like a sudden glimpse of some incomprehensible machine that might be safe or might be deadly dangerous, and he was too young to know which. He was too young to understand. What's wrong? He cried. You're asking me all this because you're worried, aren't you? Why are you worried about me? Why are you worried about us? Halloran put his large dark hands on the small boy's shoulders. Stop, he said. It's probably nothing. But if it is something, well, you've got a large thing in your head, Danny. You'll have to do a lot of growing yet before you catch up to it, I guess. You've got to be brave about it. But I don't understand things, Danny burst out. I do, but I don't. People, they feel things, and I feel them, but I don't know what I'm feeling. He looked down at his lap wretchedly. I wish I could read. Sometimes Tony shows me signs, and I can hardly read any of them. Who's Tony? Halloran asked again. Mommy and Daddy call him my invisible playmate, Danny said, reciting the words carefully. But he's really real. At least I think he is. Sometimes when I try real hard to understand things, he comes. He says, Danny, I want to show you something. And it's like I pass out. Only there are dreams, like you said. He looked at Halloran and swallowed. They used to be nice, but now I can't remember the word for dreams that scare you and make you cry. Nightmares? Halloran asked. Yeah, that's right, nightmares. About this place? About the Overlook? Danny looked down at his thumb-sucking hand again. Yes, he whispered. Then he spoke shrilly, looking up into Halloran's face. But I can't tell my daddy, and you can't either. He has to have this job because it's the only one Uncle Al would get from him, and he has to finish his play or he might start doing the bad thing again, and I don't know, and I know what that is. It's getting drunk. That's what it is. It's when he used to do always be drunk, and that was a bad thing to do. He stopped on the verge of tears. Shh, shh, Halloran said. King has this habit of constantly mentioning Halloran's race in the absolute least natural way possible. He does. He does. Absolutely. I agree. Shh, Halloran said. It was his laughter, too. He called his laughter dark. Anyways, shh, Halloran said, and pulled Danny's face against the rough serge of his jacket. It smelled faintly of mothballs. That's all right, son. And if your thumb likes your mouth, let it go where it wants. But his face was troubled. He said, What you got, son? I call it shining on. The Bible calls it having visions, and there's scientists that call it precognition. I've read up on it, son. I've studied on it. They all mean seeing the future. Do you understand that? Danny nodded against Halloran's coat. I remember the strongest shine I ever had was that way. I'm not liable to forget. It was 1955. I was still in the army then, stationed overseas in West Germany. It was an hour before supper, and I was standing by the sink giving one of the KPs hell for taking too much of the potato along with the peel. I says, Here, let me show you how it's done. He held out the potato and the peeler, and the whole kitchen was gone. Bang, just like that. You see this guy, Tony, before you have dreams? Danny nodded. Halloran put an arm around him. With me, it's smelling oranges. All that afternoon I've been smelling them and thinking nothing of it because they were on the menu for that night. We had 30 crates of Valencias. Everybody in the damn kitchen was smelling oranges that night. For a minute it was like I had just passed out, and then I heard an explosion and saw flames. There was people screaming, sirens, and I heard this hissing noise that could only be steam. Then it seemed like I got a little closer to whatever it was, and I saw a railroad car off the tracks and laying on its side with Georgia A. South Carolina Railroad written on it. And I knew like a flash that my brother Carl was on that train, and they jumped the tracks and Carl was dead. Just like that. Then it was gone, and here's this scared, stupid little KP in front of me still holding out the potato and the peeler. He says, Are you okay, Sarge? And I says, No. My brother's been killed down in Georgia. When I finally got my mama on the overseas telephone, she told me how it was. But see, boy, I already knew how it was. He shook his head slowly, as if dismissing the memory, and looked down at the wide-eyed boy. But the thing you got to remember, my boy, is this. Those things don't always come true. I remember just 4 years ago I had a job cooking at a boys' camp up in Maine on Long Lake. So I'm sitting by the boarding gate at Logan Airport in Boston, just waiting to get on my flight, and I start to smell oranges. for the first time in maybe 5 years. So I say to myself, my God, what's coming on this crazy late show now? And I got down to the bathroom and I sat one of the toilets to be private. I never did black out, but I started to get this feeling, stronger and stronger, that my plane was going to crash. And the feeling went away, and the smell of oranges, and I knew it was over. I went back to the Delta Airlines desk and changed my flight to one 3 hours later. And do you know what happened? What? Danny whispered. Nothing, Halloran said and laughed. He was relieved to see the boy smile a little too. Not one single thing. That old plane landed right on time without a single bump or bruise. So you see, sometimes those feelings don't come to anything. Oh, Danny said. Or you take the racetrack. I go a lot. I usually do pretty well. I stand by the rail when they go by the starting gate. Sometimes I get a little shine about this horse or that one. Usually those feelings help me get real well. I always tell myself that someday I'm going to get three at once. I'm going to get three at once on three long shots and make enough on the trifecta to retire early. It ain't happened yet, but there's plenty of times I come home from the track on Shank's mare instead of in a taxi cab with my wallet swollen up. Nobody shines on all the time, except for maybe God in heaven. Yes, sir, Danny said, thinking of the time almost a year ago when Tony showed up a new baby lying in a crib at their house in Stovington. He had been very excited about that, and had waited, knowing that it took time, but there had been no new baby. Now you listen, Halloran said, and took both of Danny's hands on his own. I've had some bad dreams here, and I've had some bad feelings. I've worked here 2 seasons now, and maybe a dozen times I've had, nightmares. And maybe half a dozen times I've thought I've seen things. No, I won't say what. It ain't for a little boy like you. Just nasty things. Once it had something to do with those damn hedges clipped to look like animals. Another time there was a maid, Dolores Vickery her name was. She had a little shine to her, but I don't think she knew it. Mr. Ullman fired her. Do you know what that is, Doc? Yes, sir, Danny said candidly. My daddy got fired from his teaching job, and that's why we're in Colorado, I guess. Well, Ullman fired her on account of her saying she'd seen something in one of those rooms where a bad thing happened. That was room 217, and I want you to promise me you won't go in there, Danny. Not all winter. Steer right clear. I've highlighted that there. Room 217 is the one he specifies. All right, Danny said. Did the maid, did she ask you to go look? Yes, she did. And there was a bad thing there, but I don't think it was a bad thing that could hurt anyone, Danny. That's what I'm trying to say. People who shine can sometimes see things that are going to happen, and sometimes they can see things that did happen, but they're just like pictures in a book. Did you ever see a picture in a book that scared you, Danny? Yes, he said, thinking of the story of Bluebeard and the picture where Bluebeard's new wife opens the door and sees all the heads. But you knew it couldn't hurt you, didn't you? Yes, Danny said, a little dubious. Well, that's how it is in this hotel. I don't know why, but it seems like all the bad things that ever happened here, there's little pieces of those things still laying around, like fingernail clippings or the boogers of somebody nasty wiped under a chair. I don't know why it should be here. There's bad things going on in about every hotel in the world, I guess, and I've worked a lot of them and had no trouble. Only here. But Danny, I don't think those things can hurt anybody. He emphasized each word in the sentence with a mild shake of the boy's shoulders. So if you should see something in a hallway or in a room or outside by those hedges, just look the other way, and when you look back, it'll be gone. Are you digging me? Yes, Danny said. He felt much better, soothed. He got up on his knees and kissed Halloran's cheek and gave him a big hard hug. Halloran hugged him back. When he released the boy, he asked, Your folks, they don't shine, do they? No, I don't think so. I tried them like I did you, Halloran said. Your mama jumped the tiniest bit. I think all mothers shine a little, at least until their kids grow up enough to watch out for themselves. Your dad... Halloran paused momentarily. He had probed the boy's father, and he just didn't know. It wasn't like meeting someone who had the shine, or someone who definitely did not. Poking at Danny's father had been strange, as if Jack Torrance hid something, or Jack Torrance had something that he was hiding, or something that he was holding in so deeply submerged in himself that it was impossible to get to. I don't think he shines at all, Halloran finished. So you don't worry about them. You just take care of you. I don't think there's anything here that can hurt you, so just be cool, okay? Okay. Danny! Hey, Doc! Danny looked around. That's Mom. She wants me. I have to go. I know you do, Halloran said. You have a good time here, Danny. Best you can, anyway. I will. Thanks, Mr. Halloran. I feel a lot better. A smiling thought came in his mind. Dick to my friends. Yes, Dick. Okay. Their eyes met, and Dick Halloran winked. Danny scrambled across the seat of the car and opened the passenger side door. As he was getting out, Halloran said, Danny? What? What? I have this next passage highlighted. If there is trouble, you give a call, a big loud holler like the one you gave a few minutes ago. I might hear you all the way down in Florida, and if I do, I'll come on the run. Okay, Danny said and smiled. You take care, big boy. I will. Danny slammed the door and ran across the parking lot toward the porch where Wendy had stood, holding her elbows against the chill wind. Halloran watched, the big grin slowly fading. I don't think there's anything here that can hurt you. I don't think. But what if he was wrong? He had known that this was his last season at the Overlook ever since he had seen that thing in the bathtub of room 217. It had been worse than any picture in any book, and from here the boy run into his mother looked so small. I don't think. His eyes drifted down to the topiary animals. Abruptly, he started the car and put it in gear and drove away, trying not to look back. And of course he did, and of course the porch was empty. They had gone back inside. It was as if the Overlook had swallowed them. That's the end of chapter 11. Oh boy. All right. So that's chapter 11, The Shining. We learned what The Shining is. We learned what the name of the book is why it's called that. Why it's called The Shining. Because that is Dick Halloran's slang term for the certain type of psychic gift that he and Danny have. And they sort of implied that it's because he's got a very religious grandma. He sort of implies that like the reason it's called The Shining is because it's like he says the only person who shines all the time is God in heaven. He's like shining like you're holy sort of. It's like a religious thing sort of for him. So that's where that name comes from. And he sees because it makes a good allegory for different people have different levels of shine to them. So that's where that comes from. Now we understand a lot more, I think, about Danny, what's going on with him. I would say at this point it's pretty conclusively not meant to be interpreted as like, oh, he's just a smart kid. You know what I mean? Like they give you a little bit of this and that at the beginning. I think he toys around with your expectations a little bit there, but by chapter 11, we're like, this is a supernatural book. Daddy is a psychic. We're no longer. There's not really going to be any room for questioning that at this point. And it's Stephen King. He loves psychic children. He loves them. His love started with Carrie, um, and it continues with Doc, and it will continue for many books after this. All right. Chapter 12 is called The Grand Tour. And we're going to get a tour of the hotel. What were you talking about, hon? Wendy asked him as they went back inside. Oh, nothing much. For nothing much, it sure was a long talk. He shrugged, and Wendy saw Danny's paternity in the gesture. Jack could hardly have done it better himself. She would get no more out of Danny. She felt strong exasperation mixed with an even stronger love. The love that was helpless. The exasperation came from a feeling that she was deliberately being excluded. With the two of them around, she sometimes felt like an outsider, a bit player who had accidentally wandered on stage while the main action was taking place. Well, they wouldn't be able to exclude her this winter. Her two exasperating males. Quarters were going to be a little too close for that. She suddenly realized she was feeling jealous of the closeness between her husband and her son, and she felt ashamed. This was too close to the way her own mother might have felt. Too close for comfort. The lobby was now empty, except for Ullman and the head desk clerk. They were at the register, cashing up. Hold on, I got a drop of water I gotta clean off here. A couple of maids who had changed to warm slacks and sweaters, standing by the front door and looking out with their luggage pooled around them, and Watson, the maintenance man. He caught her looking at him and gave her a wink, a decidedly lecherous one. She looked away hurriedly. Jack was over by the window just outside the restaurant. Just outside the restaurant, studying the view. He looked rapt and dreamy. The cash register apparently checked out because now Ullman ran it shut with an authoritative snap. He initialed the tape and put it in a small zipper case. Wendy silently applauded the head clerk. He looked greatly relieved. Ullman looked like the type of man who might take any shortage out of the head clerk's hide without ever spilling a drop of blood. Wendy didn't much care for Ullman or his officious, ostentatiously bustling manner. He was like every boss she'd ever had, male or female. He would be saccharine sweet with the guests, and a petty tyrant when he was backstage with the help. But now school was out, and the head clerk's pleasure was written large on his face. It was out for everyone but she and Jack and Danny, anyway. Mr. Torrance, Ullman called peremptorily. Would you come over here, please? Jack walked over, nodding to Wendy and Danny that they were to come too. The clerk, who had gone into the back, now came out again wearing an overcoat. Have a pleasant winter, Mr. Ullman. I doubt it, Ullman said distantly. May 12th, Braddock. Not a day earlier, not a day later. Yes, sir. Braddock walked around the desk, his face sober and dignified, as befitted his position, but when his back was entirely to Ullman, he grinned like a schoolboy. He spoke briefly to the two girls still waiting by the door for their ride. What's this? I gotta clean this off. He spoke briefly to the two girls still waiting by the door for their ride, and he was followed out by a brief burst of stifled laughter. Now Wendy began to notice the silence of the place. It had fallen over the hotel like a heavy blanket, muting everything but the faint pulse of the afternoon wind outside. From where she stood, she could look through the inner office, now neat to the point of sterility with its two bare desks and two sets of gray filing cabinets. Beyond that, she could see Halloran's spotless kitchen, the big porthole double doors propped open by rubber wedges. I thought I would take a few extra minutes and show you the hotel, Ullman said, and Wendy reflected that you could always hear the capital H in Ullman's voice. You were supposed to hear it. I'm sure your husband will get to know the ins and outs of the Overlook quite well, Miss Torrance, but you and your son will doubtless keep more to the lobby level on the first floor, where your quarters are. Doubtless, Wendy murmured demurely, and Jack shot her a private glance. It's a beautiful place, Ullman said expensively. I rather enjoy showing it off. I'll bet you do, Wendy thought. Let's go up to third and work our way down, Ullman said. He sounded positively enthused. If we're keeping you, Jack began. Not at all, Ullman said. The shop is shut. Too fiend for the season, at least. And I plan to overnight in Boulder, at the Boulderado, of course, the only decent hotel this side of Denver, except for the Overlook itself, of course. This way. They stepped into the elevator together. It was ornately scrolled in copper and brass, but it settled appreciably before Ullman pulled the gate across. Danny stirred a little uneasily, and Ullman smiled down at him. Danny tried to smile back without notable success. Don't you worry, little man, Ullman said. Safe as houses. So was the Titanic, Jack said, looking up at the cut glass globe in the center of the elevator ceiling. Wendy bit the inside of her cheek to keep the smile away, but Ullman was not amused. He slid the inner gate across with a rattle and a bang. The Titanic made only one voyage, Mr. Torrance. This elevator has made thousands of them since it was installed in 1926. That's reassuring, Jack said. He ruffled Danny's hair. The plane ain't gonna crash, Doc. Ullman threw the lever over, and for a moment there was nothing but the shuddering beneath their feet and the tortured whine of the motor below them. Wendy had a vision of the four of them being trapped between floors like flies in a bottle and found in the spring, with little pieces and bits gone, like the Donner Party. Stop it! The elevator began to rise, with some vibration and clashing and banging from below at first. Then the ride smoothed out. At the third floor, Ullman brought them to a bumpy stop, retracted the gate, and opened the door. The elevator car was still 6 inches below floor level. Danny gazed at the difference in height between the third floor hall and the elevator floor as if he had just sensed the universe was not as sane as he had been told. Ullman cleared his throat and raised the car a little, brought it up to a stop with a jerk, still 2 inches below, and they all climbed out. With their weight gone, the car rebounded almost to floor level, something Wendy did not find reassuring at all. Safe as houses or not, she resolved to take the stairs when she had to go up or down this place, and under no conditions would she allow the three of them to get into the rickety thing together. What are you looking at, Doc? Jack inquired humorously. See any spots there? Of course not, Ullman said, nettled. All the rugs were shampooed just 2 days ago. Wendy glanced down at the hall runner herself. Pretty, but definitely not anything she would choose for her own home, if the day ever came when she had one. Deep blue pile it was entwined with what seemed to be a surrealistic jungle scene full of ropes and vines and trees filled with exotic birds. It was hard to tell just what sort of birds, because all the interweaving was done in unshaded black, giving only silhouettes. Do you like the rug? Wendy asked Danny. Yes, Mom, he said colorlessly. They walked down the hall, which was comfortably wide. The wallpaper was silk, a lighter blue to go against the rug. Electric flambeaux stood at 10-foot intervals at a height of about 7 feet. Fashioned to look like London gas lamps, the bulbs were massed behind cloudy, cream-hued glass that was bound with crisscrossing iron strips. I like those very much, she said. Ullman nodded, pleased. Mr. DeWent had those installed throughout the hotel after the war. Number 2, I mean. In fact, most, although not all, of the third floor decorating scheme was his idea. This is 300, the presidential suite. He twisted his key in the lock of the mahogany double doors and swung them wide. The sitting room's wide western exposure made them all gasp, which had probably been Ullman's intention. He smiled. Quite a view, isn't it? It sure is, Jack said. The window ran nearly the length of the sitting room, and beyond it the sun was poised directly between two sawtooth peaks, casting golden light across the rock faces and the sugared snow on the high tips. The clouds around and behind this picture, postcard view, were also tinted gold, and a sunbeam glinted duskily down into the darkly pooled firs below the timberline. Jack and Wendy were so absorbed in the view that they didn't look down at Danny, who was staring not out at the window but at the red and white striped silk wallpaper to the left, where a door opened to an interior bedroom, and his gasp, which had been mingled with theirs, had nothing to do with beauty. Great splashes of dried blood, flecked with tiny bits of grayish white tissue, clotted the wallpaper. It made Danny feel sick. It was like a crazy picture drawn in blood, a surrealistic etching of a man's face drawn back in terror and pain. The mouth yawning and half the head pulverized. So if you should see something, just look the other way. When you look back, it'll be gone. Are you digging me? He deliberately looked out the window, being careful to show no expression on his face, and when his mommy's hand closed over his own, he took it, being careful not to squeeze it or give a signal of any kind. The manager was saying something to his daddy about making sure to shutter that big window so a strong wind wouldn't blow it in. Jack was nodding. Danny looked cautiously back at the wall. The big dried blood stain was gone. Those little gray-white flecks that had been scattered all over through it, they were gone too. Then Ullman was leading them out. Mommy asked him if he thought the mountains were pretty. Danny said he did, although he didn't really care for the mountains one way or the other. As Ullman was closing the door behind them, Danny looked back over his shoulder. The bloodstain had returned, only now it was fresh. It was running. Ullman, looking directly at it, went on with his running commentary about the famous men who had stayed here. Danny discovered that he'd bitten his lip hard enough to make it bleed, and he'd never even felt it. As they walked on down the corridor, he fell a little bit behind the others and wiped the blood away with the back of his hand, and thought about blood. Did Master Halloran see the blood, or was it something worse? I don't think those things can hurt you. There was an iron scream behind his lips, but he would not let it out. His mommy and daddy could not see such things. They never had. He would keep quiet. His mommy and daddy were loving each other, and that was a real thing. The other things were just like pictures in a book. Some pictures were scary, but they couldn't hurt you. They couldn't hurt you. Mr. Ullman showed them some other rooms on the third floor, leading them through the corridors that twisted and turned like a maze. They were all sweets up here, Mr. Ullman said, although Danny didn't see any candy. He showed them through some rooms where a lady named Marilyn Monroe once stayed, when she was married to a man named Arthur Miller. Danny got a vague understanding that Marilyn and Arthur had gotten a divorce not long after they were in the Overlook Hotel. Mommy? What, honey? If they were married, why did they have different names? You and Daddy have the same names. Yes, but we're not famous, Danny, Jack said. Famous women keep their same names even after they get married because their names are their bread and butter. Bread and butter, Danny said, completely mystified. What Daddy means is that people used to like to go to the movies and see Marilyn Monroe, Wendy said. But they might not like to go to see Marilyn Miller. Why not? She'd still be the same lady. Wouldn't everyone know that? Yes, but she looked at Jack helplessly, sorry. Uh, Truman Capote once stayed in this room. Don't know who that is. Ullman interrupted impatiently. He opened the door. That was in my time. An awfully nice man. Continental manners. There was nothing remarkable in any of these rooms except for the absence of suites, which Mr. Ullman kept calling them, and nothing that Danny was afraid of. In fact, there was only one other thing on the third floor that bothered Danny, and he could not have said why. There was a fire extinguisher on the wall just before they had turned the corner and went back into the elevator, which stood open and waiting like a mouthful of gold teeth. It was an old-fashioned extinguisher, a flat hose folded back a dozen times upon itself, one end attached to a large red valve, the other ending in a brass nozzle. The folds of the hose were secured with a red steel slat on a hinge. In case of a fire, you could knock the steel slat up and out of the way with one hard push, and the hose was yours. Danny could see that much. He was good at seeing how things worked. By the time he was 2 and a half, he had been unlocking the protective gate his father had installed at the top of the stairs in the Stovington house. He had seen how the lock worked. Daddy said it was a knack. Some people had the knack, and some people didn't. This fire extinguisher was a little older than others he had seen, the one in the nursery school, for instance, but that was not so unusual. Nonetheless, it had filled him with a faint unease, curled up there against the light blue wallpaper like a sleeping snake. He was glad it was out of sight. He was glad when it was out of sight around the corner. Of course, all the windows have to be shuttered, Mr. Ullman said as they stepped back into the elevator. Once again, the car sank queasily beneath their feet. But I'm particularly concerned about the one in the presidential suite. The original bill on that window was $420. That was over 30 years ago. It would cost 8 times that to replace today. I'll shutter it, Jack said. They went back down to the second floor where there was more rooms and even more twists and turns in the corridor. The light from the windows had begun to fade appreciably now as the sun went behind the mountains. Mr. Ullman showed them 1 or 2 rooms and that was all. He walked past 217, the one Dick Halloran had warned him about, without slowing. Danny looked at the bland number plate on the door with an uneasy fascination. Then down to the first floor. Mr. Ullman didn't show them into any rooms here till they almost reached the thickly carpeted staircase that led down to the lobby again. Here are your quarters, he said. I think you'll find them adequate. They went in. Danny was braced for whatever might be there, but there was nothing. Wendy Torrance felt a strong surge of relief. The presidential suite, with its cold elegance, had made her feel awkward and clumsy. It was all very well to visit some restored historical building with a bedroom plaque that announced Abraham Lincoln or Franklin D. Roosevelt had slept there, but another thing entirely to imagine you and your husband lying beneath acreages of linen and perhaps making love where the greatest men in the world had once lain. Or the most powerful, anyway, she amended. But this apartment was simpler, homier, almost inviting. She thought she could abide this place for a season with no great difficulty. "It's very pleasant," she said to Ullman, and heard the gratitude in her voice. Ullman nodded. "Simple but adequate. During the season the suite quarters the cook and his wife, or the cook and his apprentice." "Mr. Halloran lived here?" Danny broke in. Mr. Ullman inclined his head to Danny condescendingly. "Quite so. He and Mr. Nevers." He turned back to Jack and Wendy. "This is the sitting room." There were several chairs that looked comfortable but not expensive, a coffee table that had once been expensive but now had a long chip gone from the side, two bookcases stuffed full of Reader's Digest condensed books and Detective Book Club trilogies from the 40s, Wendy saw with some amusement, and an anonymous hotel TV that looked much less elegant than the buffed wood consoles in the rooms. "No kitchen, of course," Ullman said, "but there is a dumbwaiter. This apartment is directly over the kitchen." Sorry, I'm having heartburn. He slid aside a square of paneling and disclosed a wide square tray. He gave it a push and it disappeared, trailing rope behind it. "It's a secret passage," Danny said excitedly to his mother, momentarily forgetting all fears in favor of that intoxicating chef behind the wall. "Just like in Abbott and Costello Meet the Monsters." Mr. Ullman frowned, but Wendy smiled indulgently. Danny ran over to the dumbwaiter and peered down the shaft. "This way, please." He opened the door on the far side of the living room. It gave on the bedroom, which was spacious and airy. There were twin beds. Wendy looked at her husband and smiled and shrugged. "No problem," Jack said. "We'll push 'em together." Mr. Ullman looked over his shoulder, honestly puzzled. Beg pardon?" "The beds," Jack said pleasantly. "We can push 'em together." "Oh, quite," Ullman said, momentarily confused. Then his face cleared and a red flush began to creep up under the collar of his shirt. "Whatever you like." He led them back into the sitting room, where a second door appeared, on a second bedroom. This one equipped with bunk beds. A radiator clanked in one corner, and the rug on the floor was a hideous embroidery of western sage and cactus. Danny had already fallen in love with it, Wendy saw. The walls of this smaller room were paneled in real pine. "Think you can stand it in here, Doc?" Jack asked. "Sure I can. I'm going to sleep in the top bunk, okay?" "If that's what you want." "I like the rug, too, Mr. Ullman. Why don't you have all rugs like that?" Mr. Ullman looked for a moment as if he had sunk his teeth into a lemon. Then he smiled and patted Danny's head. "Those are your quarters," he said, "except for the bath, which opens off the main bedroom. It's not a huge apartment, but of course you'll have the rest of the hotel to spread out in. The lobby fireplace is in good working order, or so Watson tells me, and you must feel free to eat in the dining room if the spirit moves you to do so." He spoke in the tone of a man conferring a great favor. "All right," Jack said. "Shall we go down?" Mr. Ullman asked. "That's fine," Wendy said. They went downstairs in the elevator, and now the lobby was wholly deserted except for Watson, who was leaning against the main doors in a rawhide jacket, a toothpick between his lips. "I would have thought you'd been miles from here by now," Mr. Ullman said, his voice slightly chill. "Just stuck around to remind Mr. Torrance here about the boiler," Watson said, straightening up. "Keep your good weather eye on her, fella, and she'll be fine. Knock the press down a couple of times a day. She creeps." She creeps, Danny thought, and the words echoed down a long and silent corridor in his mind, a corridor lined with mirrors where people seldom looked. "I will," his daddy said. "You'll be fine," Watson said, and offered his hand. Jack shook it. Watson turned to Wendy and inclined his head. "Ma'am," he said. "I'm pleased," Wendy said. Thought it would sound absurd, but it didn't. She had come out here from New England, where she had spent her life, and it seemed to her that in a few short sentences this man, Watson, with his fluffy fringe of hair, had epitomized what the West was supposed to be about. And never mind the lecherous wink earlier. "Young Master Torrance," Watson said gravely, and put out his hand. Danny, who had known all about handshaking for almost a year now, put his own hand out gingerly and felt it swallowed up. "You take good care of 'em, Dan." "Yes, sir." Watson let go of Danny's hand and straightened up fully. He looked at Ullman. "Until next year, I guess," he said, and held his hand out. Ullman touched it bloodlessly. His pinky ring caught the lobby's electric lights in a baleful sort of wink. "May 12th, Watson," he said. "Not a day earlier or later." "Yes, sir," Watson said, and Jack could almost read the codicil in Watson's mind. "You fucking little," and then there's the F slur here. "Have a good winter, Mr. Ullman." "Oh, I doubt it," Ullman said remotely. Watson opened one of the two big main doors. The wind whined louder and began to flutter the collar of his jacket. "You folks take care now," he said. It was Danny who answered. "Yes, sir, we will." Watson, whose not so distant ancestor had owned this place, slipped humbly through the door. It closed behind him, muffling the wind. Together they watched him clop down the porch's broad front steps into the battered black cowboy boots. In his battered black cowboy boots, obviously. Brittle yellow aspen leaves tumbled around his heels as he crossed the lot into his International Harvester pickup and climbed in. Blue smoke jetted from the rusted exhaust pipe as he started it up. The spell of silence held among them as he backed, and then pulled out of the parking lot. His truck disappeared over the brow of the hill, and then reappeared smaller on the main road, heading west. For a moment, Danny felt more lonely than he ever had in his life. And that's the end of chapter 12. Whew, I'm going to take another quick bathroom break. We got enough time to get through at least one more, probably two more, if we're lucky. Whew, all right, that was creepy. Is everybody still with me? We saw that Danny got to see his first of the pictures in a book that Halloran warned him about. But when he followed his advice, it turned out to work perfectly. He said those things can't hurt you. They're just visions that are being picked up by your gift. You just look away and they'll be gone. And it worked. It was not able to hurt him. So that's comforting at least. Anybody pass out? I'll forgive you if you did, but not for a couple years. Probably talk to you again in a few years. Nah. Woo! Still here. Woo! I love Mr. Halloran. He's great. He's a bundle of joy. I'm alive. That means I only need one more for roll call. I can check some of the stuff anyway while I wait. Come on, it's roll call. Making sure y'all still with me. I need one more person. I'll give you till 11:40 to come through, report. Uh-oh. It's not looking good. Uh-oh. It's 11:39. Well, that's a shame. I got it recorded so she can always catch up. Let me mark the last time I heard from her so that she can pick up easily in the morning or whatever. Okay. I'll DM. I'll say 12. That way I can remember the last time I heard from her was before chapter 12. Chapter 13. The Front Porch. The Torrance family stood together on the long front porch of the Overlook Hotel, as if posing for a family portrait. Danny in the middle, zippered into last year's fall jacket, which was now too small and starting to come out at the elbow. Wendy behind him with one hand on his shoulder, and Jack to his left, his own hand resting lightly on his son's head. Mr. Allman was a step below them, buttoned in an expensive-looking brown mohair overcoat. The sun was entirely behind the mountains now, edging them with gold fire, making the shadows around things look long and purple. The only three vehicles left in the parking lots were the hotel truck, Allman's Lincoln Continental, and the battered Torrance VW. "You've got your keys, then," Ullman said to Jack, "and you understand fully about the furnace and the boiler?" Jack nodded, feeling some real sympathy for Ullman. Everything was done for the season. The ball of string was neatly wrapped up until May 12th, not a day earlier or later. And still, Ullman, who was responsible for it all, and who referred to the hotel in the unmistakable tones of infatuation, could not help but look for loose ends. "I think everything is well in hand," Jack said. "Good. I'll be in touch." But he still lingered for a moment, as if waiting for the wind to take his hand and perhaps gust him down to his car. He sighed. "All right. Have a good winter, Mr. Torrance. Miss Torrance. You too, Danny." "Thank you, sir," Danny said. "I hope you do, too." "I doubt it," Ullman repeated, and he sounded sad. "This place in Florida is a dump, and if the out-and-out truth is to be spoken, it's busy work. The Overlook is my real job. Take good care of it for me, Mr. Torrance." "I think it'll still be here when you get back next spring," Jack said, and a thought flashed through Danny's mind. "But will we?" and was gone. Of course it will." Ullman looked out toward the playground where the hedge animals were clattering in the wind. Then he nodded once more in a businesslike way. "Goodbye, then." He walked quickly and prissily across to his car, a ridiculously big one for such a little man, and tucked himself into it. The Lincoln's motor purred to life, and all of his tail lights Sorry, and his tail lights flashed as he pulled out of his parking stall. Oh, my heartburn's hitting me. As the car moved away, Jack could read the small sign at the head of the stall. Reserved for Mr. Ullman, MGR. Right, Jack said softly. They watched until the car was out of sight, headed down the eastern slope. When it was gone, the three of them looked at each other for a silent, almost frightened moment. They were alone. Aspen leaves whirled and skittered in aimless packs across the lawn that was now neatly mowed and tended for no guest's eyes. There was no one to see the autumn leaves steal across the grass but the three of them. It gave Jack a curious, shrinking feeling, as if his life force had dwindled to a mere spark while the hotel and the grounds had suddenly doubled in size and become sinister, dwarfing them with sullen, inanimate power. Then Wendy said, "Look at you, Doc. Your nose is running like a fire hose. Let's get inside." And they did, closing the door firmly behind them against the restless whine of the wind. That's the end of Closing Day. Part 3 is called The Wasp's Nest. I think we can get through chapter 14. I'm pretty sure it's a pretty long one. I think we're going to get through chapter 14, and then if we have a little time to spare, maybe we can go over some of our thoughts and stuff. I remember this one being pretty long. So let's do part 3, The Wasp's Nest. Chapter 14, Up on the Roof. "Oh, you goddamn fucking son of a bitch!" Jack Torrance cried those words at... "Maybe? What are you said maybe for? I just took roll call to see if you were still awake. Were you in the bathroom?" Oh my god. I was like, I'll give her till 11:40 to see if she's still here. You must have been taking a break. Or you fell asleep and just woke back up. No, maybe to the more thoughts. No, I know. I'm asking you where the fuck you were I was asking you for you a minute ago. I know what you meant. I'm asking if you had dozed off or if you got up or what happened when I did roll call to see who was still here. Have you missed anything? Is there anything I need to go back over? Twitch was being a fuck. I had to refresh a bunch. Okay, did you miss out on chapter 12 or do you know? I DM'd you at 12 because I was like, I think she fell asleep and I want her to remember that she can start on chapter 12. We'll keep going. The recording will be up tomorrow morning. If you need to do some scrubbing to fill in some loose ends, that's fine. Chapter 14, Up on the Roof. "Oh, you goddamn fucking son of a bitch!" Jack Torrance cried these words out in both surprise and agony as he slapped his right hand against his blue chambray work shirt, dislodging the big, slow-moving wasp that had stung him. Then he was scrambling up the roof as fast as he could, looking back over his shoulder to see if the wasp's brothers and sisters were rising from the nest he had uncovered to do battle. If they were, it could be bad. The nest was between him and his ladder, and the trapdoor leading down to the attic was locked from the inside. The drop was 70 feet from the roof to the cement patio between the hotel and the lawn. The clear air above the nest was still and undisturbed. Jack whistled disgustedly between his teeth, sat straddling the back of the roof, and examined his right index finger. It was swelling already, and he supposed he would have to try and creep past that nest in order to get to his ladder so he could go down and put some ice on it. It was October 20. Wendy and Danny had gone down to Sidewinder in the hotel truck, an elderly, rattling Dodge that was still more trustworthy than the VW, which was now wheezing gravely in Seam Terminal, to get 3 gallons of milk and do some Christmas shopping. It was early to shop, but there was no telling when the snow would come to stay. There had already been flurries, and in some places the road down from the overlook was slick with patch ice. So far the fall had been almost preternaturally beautiful. In the 3 weeks they had been here, golden day had followed golden day. Crisp 30-degree mornings gave way to afternoon temperatures in the low 60s, the perfect temperature for climbing around on the overlooked gently sloping western roof and doing the shingling. Jack had admitted freely to Wendy that he could have finished the job 4 days ago, but he felt no real urge to hurry. The view from up here was spectacular, even putting the vista from the presidential suite in the shade. More important, the work itself was soothing. On the roof, he felt himself healing from the troubled wounds of the last 3 years. On the roof, he felt at peace. Those 3 years began to seem like a turbulent nightmare. The shingles had been badly rotted, some of them blown entirely away by the last winter's storms. He had ripped them all up, yelling "Bombs away!" as he dropped them over the side, not wanting Danny to get hit in case he had wandered over. He had been pulling out bad flashing when the wasp had gotten him. The ironic part was that he warned himself each time he climbed onto the roof to keep an eye out for nests. He had gotten that bug bomb just in case, but this morning the stillness and peace had been so complete that his watchfulness had lapsed. He had been back in the world of the play he was slowly creating, roughing out whatever scene he would be working on that evening in his head. The play was going very well, and although Wendy had said little, he knew she was pleased. He had been roadblocked on the crucial scene between Denker, the sadistic headmaster, and Gary Benson, his young hero, during the last unhappy 6 months at Stovington, months when the craving for a drink had been so bad that he could barely concentrate on his in-class lectures, let alone his extracurricular literary ambitions. That's the time when he started to go sober, you might recall. But in the last 12 evenings, he actually sat down in front of the office model Underwood he had borrowed from the main office downstairs. The roadblock had disappeared under his fingers as magically as cotton candy dissolves on the lips. He had come up almost effortlessly with the insights into Denker's character that he had always been lacking, and he had rewritten most of the second act accordingly, making it revolve around the new scene. And the progress of the third act, which he had been turning over in his mind when the Wasp put an end to cogitation, was coming clearer all the time. He thought he could run it over in 2 weeks, and have a clean copy of the whole damn play by New Year's. He had an agent in New York, a tough red-headed woman named Phyllis Sandler, who smoked Herbert Tarrytons, drank Jim Beam from a paper cup, and thought the literary sun rose and set on Sean O'Casey. She had marketed 3 of Jack's short stories, including the Esquire piece. He had written to her about the play, which was called The Little School, describing the basic conflict between Denker, a gifted student who had failed into becoming the brutal and brutalizing headmaster of a turn-of-the-century New England prep school, and Gary Benson, a student he sees as a younger version of himself. Phyllis had written back, expressing interest and admonishing to read O'Casey before sitting down to it. She had written again earlier that year, asking where the hell's the play? He had written back wryly that the little school had been indefinitely and, perhaps infinitely, delayed between hand and page in that interesting intellectual goby known as the writer's block. Now it had looked as if she might actually get the play. Whether or not it was any good, or if it would ever see actual production, was another matter, and he didn't seem to care a great deal about those things. He felt in a way that the play itself, the whole thing, was the roadblock, a colossal symbol of the bad years at Stovington Prep, the marriage he had almost totaled like a nutty kid behind the wheel of an old jalopy, the monstrous assault on his son, the incident in the parking lot with George Hatfield, an incident he could no longer view as just another sudden and destructive flare of his temper. He now thought that part of his drinking problem had stemmed from an unconscious desire to be free of Stovington, and the security he felt was stifling whatever creative urge he had. He had stopped drinking, but the need to be free had been just as great. Hence George Hatfield. Now all that remained of those days was the play on his desk and in Wendy's bedroom. Now all that remained of these days was the play on the desk in his and Wendy's bedroom, and when it was done and sent to Phyllis's hole-in-the-wall New York agency, he could turn to other things. Not a novel, he was not ready to stumble into the swamp of another 3-year undertaking, but surely more short stories, perhaps a book of them. Moving warily, he scrambled back down the slope on the roof on his hands and knees, past the line of demarcation where the fresh green bird shingles gave way to the section of the roof he had just finished clearing. He came to the edge on the left of the wasp's nest he had uncovered, and moved gingerly toward it, ready to backtrack and bolt down his ladder to the ground if things looked too hot. He leaned over the section of the pulled-out flashing and looked in. The nest was in there, tucked into the space between the old flashing and the final roof undercoating of 3x5s. It was a damn big one. The grayish paper ball looked to Jack as if it might be nearly 2 feet through the center. Jesus Christ. Its shape was not perfect because the space between the flashing and the boards was too narrow, but he thought the little buggers had still done a pretty respectable job. The surface of the nest was a crawl with the lumbering, slow-moving insects. They were the big, mean ones. Not yellow jackets, which were smaller and calmer, but wall wasps. They had been rendered sludgy and stupid by the fall temperatures, but Jack, who knew about wasps from his childhood, counted himself lucky that he had been stung only once. And, he thought, if Ullman had hired the job done in the height of the summer, the workman who tore up that particular section of the flashing would have gotten one hell of a surprise. Yes, indeedy. When a dozen wall wasps land on you all at once and start stinging your face and your hands and arms, stinging your legs right through your pants, it would be entirely possible to forget you were 70 feet up. You might just charge right off the edge of the roof while you were trying to get away from them. All from those little things, the biggest of them only half the length of a pencil stub. He had read some place in a Sunday supplement piece or a back-of-the-book news magazine article that 7% of all automobile fatalities go unexplained. No mechanical failure, no excessive speed, no booze, no bad weather. Simply one car crashes on deserted sections of the road, one dead occupant, the driver unable to explain what had happened to him. The article had included an interview with a state trooper who called those who theorized that many of those so-called food crashes resulted from insects in the car. Wasps, a bee, possibly even a spider or moth. The driver gets panicky, tries to swat it or unroll a window to let it out. Possibly the insect stings him. Maybe the driver just loses control. Either way, it's bang, all over. And the insect, usually completely unharmed, would buzz merrily out of the smoking wreck, looking for greener pastures. A trooper had been in favor of having pathologists look for insect venom while autopsying such victims, Jack recalled. Now, looking down at the nest, it seemed to him that it could serve as both a workable symbol for what he had been through, and what he had dragged his hostages to fortune through, and an omen for a better future. How else could you explain the things that had happened to him? For he still felt that the whole range of unhappy Stovington experiences had to be looked at with Jack Torrance in the passive mode. He had not done things. Things had been done to him. He had he had known plenty of people on the Stovington faculty, two of them right in the English department, who were hard drinkers. Zach Tunney was in the habit of picking up a full keg of beer on a Saturday afternoon, plunking it in a backyard snowbank overnight, and then killing damn near all of it on Sunday watching football games and old movies. Yet through the week, Jack was as sober as a judge. A weak cocktail with lunch was an occasion. He and Al Shockley had been alcoholics. They sought each other out like two cast-offs who were still social enough to prefer drowning together than doing it alone. The sea had been whole grain instead of salt, that was all. Looking down at the wasps as they slowly went about their instinctual business before winter closed down to kill all but their hibernating queen, he would go further. He was he was still an alcoholic. He always would be. Perhaps it had been since sophomore class night in high school when he had taken his first drink. It had nothing to do with willpower, or the morality of drinking, or the weakness or strength of his own character. There was a broken switch somewhere inside, or a circuit breaker that didn't work, and he had been propelled down the chute willy-nilly, slowly at first, then accelerated as Stovington applied its pressures to him. A big grease slide, and at the bottom had been a shattered, ownerless bicycle, and a son with a broken arm. Jack Torrance in the passive mode. And his temper, same thing. All his life had been trying unsuccessfully to control it. He could remember himself at 7, spanked by a neighbor lady for playing with matches. He had gone out and hurled a rock at a passing car. His father had seen that, and he had descended on little Jackie, roaring. He had reddened Jack's behind, and then blacked his eye. And when his father had gone into the house, muttering to see what was on television, Jack had come upon a stray dog and had kicked it into the gutter. There had been 24 fights in grammar school, and even more of them in high school, warranting 2 suspensions and uncounted detentions, in spite of his good grades. Football had provided a partial safety valve, although he remembered perfectly well that he had spent most of every minute of every game in a state of high piss-off, taking every opposing block and tackle personally. He had been a fine player, making all conference in his junior and senior years, and he knew perfectly well that he had his own bad temper to thank, or to blame. He had not enjoyed football. Every game was a grudge match. And yet, through it all, he hadn't felt like a son of a bitch. He hadn't felt mean. He had always regarded himself as Jack Torrance, a really nice guy who was just going to have to learn how to cope with his temper someday before it got him into trouble. The same way he was going to have to learn how to cope with his drinking. But he had been an emotional alcoholic just as surely as he had been a physical one. The two of them were no doubt tied together somewhere deep inside him, where you'd just as soon not look. But it didn't much matter to him if the root causes were interrelated or separate, sociological or physiological or psychological. He had to deal with the results, the spankings, the beatings from his old man, the suspensions, with trying to explain the school clothes torn in playground brawls, and later the hangovers, the slowly dissolving glue of his marriage, the single bicycle wheel with its bent spokes pointing to the sky, Danny's broken arm, and George Hatfield, of course. He had felt he had unwittingly stuck in his hand into the great wasp's nest of life. As an image it stank. As a cameo of reality, it felt it was serviceable. He had stuck his hand through some rotted flashing in high summer, and that hand and his whole arm had been consumed in holy, righteous fire, destroying conscious thought, making the concept of civilized behavior obsolete. Could you be expected to behave as a thinking human being when your hand was being impaled on red-hot darning needles? Could you be expected to live in the love of your nearest and dearest when the brown, furious cloud rose out of the hole in the fabric of things, the fabric you thought was so innocent, and arrowed straight at you? Could you be held responsible for your own actions as you ran crazily about on the sloping roof 70 feet above the ground, not knowing where you were going, not remembering that your panicky, stumbling feet could lead you crashing down and blundering right over the rain gutter and down to your death on the concrete 70 feet below? Jack didn't think you could. When you unwittingly stuck your hand into the wasp's nest, you hadn't made a covenant with the devil to give up your civilized South with its trappings of love and respect and honor. It had just happened to you, passively, with no say. You ceased to be a creature of the mind, and became a creature of the nerve endings. From college-educated man to wailing ape in 5 easy seconds. He thought about George Hatfield. And I'm going to stop it there tonight. The chapter does go on. It goes on for, I think it's not even halfway done. So I'm going to go ahead and stop it there. we talk about George Hatfield for the rest of the chapter. We're going to begin with a complete discussion on the George Hatfield story and exactly what happened that brought Jack to put his hand on him. Um, yeah, I don't know. I'm stopping there because I know how long chapter 14 is, and we might be here till 12:20 if I go through it, even without doing a little wrap up. So that's going to be it for today. As a reminder, the next chapters will come on Monday. I will be uploading the next recording, and our next live reading session will be on Thursday. Um, we learned a lot today. We got all the way through closing day and picked up 3 weeks later. We got to see the last of Mr. Ullman, the last of Mr. Watson. We got to see Mr. Halloran, and he talked about what The Shining is, and I think explained pretty well Danny's dread relating to the Overlook Hotel. You know, Danny is picking up on things that have happened in the past, maybe even things that have happened in the future, because of his shining, and it's very uncomfortable for him. He is acutely aware of all the terrible shit that has happened there without having ever read about it. This chapter, chapter 14, is particularly important. It kind of hurts me that I have to cut it in half, but that's just the way time works. Um, Jack talked about the wasp's nest metaphor and how he feels that when it comes to his temper and his drinking problem, he was totally deprived of agency when it comes to the manifestation of those problems. And that's complicated, and I don't think it's entirely right or wrong. He acknowledges that he probably, definitely, I would say, had a genetic predisposition to alcoholism, and that his temper, he never openly blamed his physically abusive father, who we just learned about, for his temper, but you can see the stirrings there. We're going to hear more about that. This is our first time learning that Jack Torrance had a physically abusive dad, um, but we will hear more about that. We know that Wendy had an emotionally abusive mom, so both of them are carrying a lot of baggage into um, their raising of Doc. But it's interesting hearing him reflect on his mistakes. Um, he's very much not claiming responsibility for them. And it's like, I mean, my instinct is to say that you should always claim responsibility for your mistakes, even if you don't really believe it's your fault. But he's having an inner monologue that is, that's private. So it's understandable for him to be reflecting in what he thinks is the most honest way about it. The wasp's nest metaphor is interesting, comparing him losing his temper to somebody freaking out because they're covered in wasps. He says, you cease to become a creature of the mind and you become a creature of the nerve endings, and he means that as in reference not only to when he gets stung by a wasp, but he means that in reference to when he broke Doc's arm and when he hit George Hatfield. He was a creature of the nerve endings. And when we pick back up, he's going to be describing exactly what happened with George Hatfield, and we're going to get to decide if we think that's true or not. So, thank you for all coming out and kicking off the Shining month with me. This is going excellent so far, I would say. I'm having a great time with it. That was a real cliffhanger that we stopped on here in the whole George Hatfield story. I'm super excited to have gotten through all of closing day. We are now, let's look, we are now, I should be able to see what percentage through the book we are. Does it not tell me? It tells me with some books. No, it doesn't tell me. I would say we're not quite a third of the way through if I had to guess, though. But I think that about does it. I am going to take some fucking heartburn pills and then probably have a fourth or fifth meal and go to bed. So, thank you guys for coming out. I really hope to see you next week as well on Thursday. But prior to that, remember, on Monday, the next section will come out, and you will have until Thursday to get caught up with that in whatever, whenever it's most convenient for you. I would strongly, strongly encourage you to take it seriously. I don't want to sound like a hard ass, but like, nothing in this book is filler. If you miss a night, you are liable to be fucking lost. So just, give it your best. I'm giving it my best. That's for damn sure. Um, so, and I know that you guys will. I'm gonna go ahead and sign off. Wait, I gotta. This Doritos chip thing is fucking rules, by the way. Nice. All right. Okay. I'm signing off. You guys get some rest. Merry Christmas. Good night.